We are live.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to the Northwestern Lehigh March 3rd workshop meeting of the school board. And at this time, I would like to ask you to join me in opening exercises. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. And would you please call the roll, Christie?
John Cassiano,
Here.
Willard Deliker,
Here.
Joseph Batzinger,
Here.
Todd Hernandez,
Here.
Todd Leiser,
Here.
Rosemary Lister,
Here.
Alan Rex,
Here.
Rachel Scheffler,
Here.
James Warfel.
Here. Thank you, all present. Welcome again to the board meeting. Before we approve the agenda, which is the next item on the agenda, I would like to make a statement about the meeting this evening for anyone who has joined us. Do we have people in the queue?
Yes.
Okay. The courtesy of the floor is intended to allow public comment prior to the board taking a vote, taking action on agenda items. This evening, we are not going to take any action on any of the agenda items, as we normally do not do in a workshop meeting. And this is my request for anyone listening this evening regarding public comment. We have 3 informational presentations on the agenda this evening. One is the elementary school reconfiguration, which is our continued exploration of solutions to the overcrowding at Northwestern Elementary. Now, this study began back in April 2019 and was tabled in January of 2020 for the 2021 school year, with the provision that it would be reviewed again for feasibility in 2021, which is our first look this evening. The second presentation is a facilities master plan that will make recommendations for the next school year, the next 4 school years. And the third presentation is our ongoing budget development presentation. We do monthly updates, as you know, who have been in attendance, as we home in on all the incoming data for the final budget plan, and as we continue to address the gap that we have in our revenues and our expenditures that was around $2.8 million deficit in January. So those are the 3 presentations that we will have this evening. And again, I want to make it clear that no action will be taken by the board this evening. All 3 presentations are informational, and all 3 topics kind of interact with each other relative to the future education decisions that we have to make. So, considering all of this, I would ask anyone who would like to address the board concerning reconfiguration, the facilities, or the budget, that you wait to hear these presentations and offer your comments at the end of the meeting during our courtesy of the floor for public comment. I would ask your indulgence to help facilitate an efficient and informative meeting by listening to these presentations for possible answers to questions you might have, and to verify that your concerns are still relevant. So the board does have the prerogative to amend the agenda so as to remove public comment from the beginning of this meeting, but I trust that you will favorably consider this request to hold your comments until after the reconfiguration facilities and budget presentations are heard. So thank you for your consideration. And with that, I would open up, again, welcome everyone this evening and open up courtesy of floor for anyone who would like to address the board.
You didn't approve the agenda yet.
I'm sorry?
You have to approve the agenda yet.
I'm sorry. First, we will approve the agenda. May I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Hernandez.
Second.
Second by Mr. Rex. Any comments or questions? Hearing none, all those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carried. Thank you. Now we'll have courtesy of floor for anybody who would like to address the board. And again, I would ask that you hold your comments regarding those three presentations until the end of the meeting. Is there anybody that raising their hand that would like to address the board at this time?
Not at this time.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you again, all of you out there who are joining us via Zoom, that for your indulgence in this request. I think it will make us more efficient this evening. So the first item on the agenda for discussion is under curriculum and building issues, the elementary reconfiguration presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Delacour. For those online who don't know me, I am Jennifer Holman. I'm the superintendent. Dr. Swisnovic is our assistant superintendent, and he and I tonight will tag team a presentation, as Mr. Delacour mentioned, to take us back to kind of the summary presentation where we left off last January. We'll talk about some historical efforts to date in terms of reconfiguration, and remembering this conversation goes back many, many years, but most recently, at least in 2009, 2014, and most recently in the 2019-20 school year. Tonight, we will discuss the educational benefits and the challenges that we previously discussed at both our board meetings and also within an advisory council made up of parents, staff, teachers, and administrators. That advisory council was formed specifically for doing research and best practices of elementary configurations, as well as present that data to the board, which we did so in January. As Mr. Delacour mentioned in his comments earlier, January 2020, we did make a decision at that point to keep for that 2021 school year 2 K through 5 elementary schools. And as you know, we are already planning and well in the planning efforts for 21-22. We do need to make a decision about the configuration of our elementary schools for the 21-22 school year as part of that planning. We will also discuss additional advantages that we have discovered as a result of the pandemic and things that we realized through this, the course of this school year. First, we'll start with what is elementary reconfiguration, and certainly as a simple definition, elementary reconfiguration is the process of changing the grade structure of students, and this is particular in our case to our elementary schools, and to realize educational and operational benefits. As you know, our current structure is 2 K through 5 elementary schools, one at Northwestern Elementary on this campus and one at Weisenberg Elementary School in Kutztown. Right now, they're divided geographically by students' residence. Residence decides which elementary school they go to. When we last discussed this in the fall and winter of 2019 and 2020, it began with a conversation in April as a facility need in terms of overcrowding at Northwestern Elementary. At that time, the board then at some point, and we will go through the dates, commissioned a professional study by an enrollment specialist, which you will see in our references as Future Think. This study in its entirety was presented to the board on November 19th, 2019 in a public meeting, and we do have all of the presentations and videos available on our site. Recommending, just as Alloy 5, which was our architectural firm that started the process in April, recommending reconfiguration, their specific recommendation was to house K through 3 at Weisenberg Elementary School and 4 through 5 at Northwestern Elementary School. As I said earlier, when we first discussed this in 2019, we did outline the educational benefits of reconfiguration to both current students as well as our future Tigers. We discussed the inequities that exist in resources, capacity, and class sizes between our elementary schools. We also projected on several enrollment projections that future inequities would be exacerbated over time due to the K-5 enrollment projections at Northwestern Elementary and Weisenberg. The goal was and continues to be to present to the school board to ensure equity and enhance the educational experience for all of our students. Examples include the distribution of our special education students, our English language learner students across both of our elementary schools, distribution of title funding across elementary schools, and the distribution that we do across both elementary schools in dividing resources. How do we achieve the most positive educational outcomes was the slide and the goal that we had at that time, while balancing the community's ability to financially support our elementary buildings in the most equitable manner. Why are we talking about this now? Well, we did, when we did the original presentation, as I said, the recommendation was for the current school year we're in. Little did we know in January, we were on the heels of a pandemic. All of the same challenges and advantages that we identified at that time, when we presented that study in January, the summary in January, we discussed that this was still a good summary of parents' data, students' data, staff data, as well as the future think information. And all of those same challenges continue to exist today. And to a degree have been exacerbated due to the current pandemic. As we begin to plan for 21-22, which is, as I said, well underway, there are many changes that we could have realized with the configuration of our buildings K through 3 and 4-5. As I said in the January and February 2020 presentation, the board approved the structure and agreed that we should evaluate this for future discussions. Our current data and research suggests that some level of COVID mitigation strategies will exist into next school year. Some degree of social distancing and face covering, but also the 12 to 15% of elementary families who continue to prefer an online education for their child. We will need to plan for all of these eventualities in the next year at least. Additionally, we will discuss how a reconfiguration could have used available space at Weisenberg to socially distance children and accommodate for online learning, which would have allowed a full return much sooner with less transitions than we are currently experiencing. And the statement that I ended our presentation in January with continues to be true, that we continue to believe that moving to a K-3, 4-5 model is the best educational decision for our students and will strengthen our learning community by providing enhanced educational opportunities and equitable resources for all of our learners. We tried to put together a concise timeline on one slide. We did give you a QR code. We do have a website and have had one since last year that has all of the information from all of these presentations, both the presentations as well as the links to the videos or any ancillary reports. As I said, we began this process in April 2019 with a board presentation by our hired architectural firm, LA5, talking about the use of our facilities, the use of our available space, and making recommendations moving forward. Our most recent discussions surrounding elementary reconfiguration are detailed on the screen. This began with the FMP presentation, which is reviewed every 1 to 5 years. You hear that we are going to review the next set of tasks coming up tonight that will review the district through a facility lens. This plan is designed to look into the future for facility needs, facility phases, and facility priorities. We also began an advisory council that was formed to research the topic. That goes into research on grade span, transportation, impact to the family, and ultimately to bring that research back to the board at a public meeting, which they did so. We did so in January. We did parent surveys, we did staff surveys to get opinions on what the board should value in terms of their decision-making priorities, what preferences were, what educational benefits were, and from a staff perspective, how often the situations at Northwestern Elementary that put students in things other than classrooms was occurring. As I said, the board commissioned an outside specialist to study enrollment boundaries and ultimately to make a recommendation to the board, which was done in November. That report is also available on the website that is available at that QR code. Ultimately, last year ending with a recommendation to maintain for the 2021 school year 2 K through 5 elementary schools and continuing to evaluate that moving forward. I will turn it over to Dr. Sosnovic, who will talk about some of those findings.
The comprehensive process Mrs. Holman outlined resulted in identification of considerations and findings in 5 key areas. With regard to enrollment, the School Board commissioned FutureThink to conduct an independent analysis of our future enrollment. FutureThink examined historical and non-public enrollment, birth and housing data, population estimates, and other key variables. In November 2019, they reported that our K-5 enrollment was projected to grow at approximately 6% by the 24-25 school year. In addition to their own assessment, FutureThink examined the then Pennsylvania Department of Education's enrollment projections, which were updated on an annual basis. They found that PDE2 projected a K-5 enrollment in the next 5 years would increase at a percent of 8. As mentioned, PDE's updates their projections at a minimum every year, so we are planning to present updated PDE projections in the near future. Other findings related to class size were identified, such as inadequate space at Northwestern Elementary for current students, which compounds when you apply future enrollment projections. Our current pandemic exacerbated this issue for us because of the social distancing requirements. In fact, we are fortunate that families are willing to change elementary schools in order to balance both schools and allow for us to return students 4 days a week to in-person learning. This is a challenge we are currently working through as we continue our planning to return grades 4 and 5. In addition to what I mentioned, there were also key findings discovered from facilities, transportation, educational standpoint, but they weren't their own slides. From a facility standpoint, our architects, LA 5, presented in April 2019 an update to the master facility plan. Through this process, LA 5 reviewed our facilities and provided recommendations that the district should consider to address facility-related issues as we look to the future. They identified in their review that 16 rooms at Weisenberg were not being used as traditional classrooms, while Northwestern Elementary lacked the commensurate space, which created challenges both instructionally and operationally. Since that time, one of those spaces has been transitioned into a CLIU classroom, bringing that total to 15 today. As a result of their analysis, Alloy 5 recommended 5 options to alleviate capacity concerns, with one of them being option 1A, realign to K3 at Weisenberg and 4-5 at Northwestern Elementary. It is important to highlight this was the same recommendation that the independent enrollment consultant, FutureThink, would later provide the district in November 2019. This chart has been updated to reflect that these capacity imbalances still exist today. If we were in a quote unquote normal year, whereby no social distancing or other mitigating measures were required, instructional staff at Northwestern Elementary would still have to use spaces such as hallways to support student learning. From a capacity standpoint, a realignment would provide an even distribution of the school's physical resources, whereby creating a more equitable learning environment for all elementary students, while still affording the district the necessary overhead capacity to accommodate more students if enrollment projections came to fruition. Transportation, and more specifically, the length of ride time for students, was a concern shared by all. It was shared by the administration, the advisory committee, and parents who responded to our survey. Through examination, it was determined that our 60-minute limit could be achieved if 2 additional buses and drivers were put into daily rotation. A maximum annual financial impact of $105,000 was presented to the board if they elected to utilize 4 drivers and buses to further reduce the 60-minute ride time. That $105,000 cost was a reduction that was realized due to plan the plan of housing additional buses at the Weisenberg Elementary School. From an educational perspective, a number of positive student learning and instructional benefits were identified by the administration and advisory committee. A K-3, 4, 5 model would afford our greatest level of educational equity for all elementary students, whereby they would have access to the same program, services, and resources in each grade level. Having all sections in one building would allow us to create special education and socioeconomic balance across each grade span, in addition to normalizing class sizes at both buildings. Our students would be afforded a more targeted focus on their developmental needs. There would be a stronger emphasis on reading to learn at K-3 and learning to read at 4-5. The realignment would allow students to build relationships with their peers across the district much earlier by unifying students in kindergarten as opposed to 6th grade. Our building school-wide cultures, positive behavior support systems, and the overall school setting in each building would be tailored to the specific needs of the younger and older students in each one. Finally, a decision as this would support our vision in creating an environment where all students participate in a highly engaging and relevant experiences, in addition to providing the district the ability to be thoughtful and strategic with our resources and facilities to ensure future sustainability. We've always recognized the relationship between home and school as an important component to any child's success. A realignment would allow each building to focus specifically on developing parent programs that would be tailored to help create strong relationships and understanding of appropriate instructional and assessment practices. Our staff would equally benefit too, as it would create more opportunity for focused professional development and centralized leaders at each grade level. I don't have to tell you that this year has been like no other for everyone. Students, parents, teachers, everyone. We do believe in retrospect that some of the challenges, such as getting students back in school 5 days a week and delivering online and in-person instruction synchronously, could have been lessened had we reconfigured this fall. A K-3, 4, 5 configuration would have afforded greater flexibility in our instructional design offerings, whereby we could have offered in-person learning earlier had we had all grade level sections in one building. We would not have to require students to transition mid-year to another building to allow in-person instruction to occur now. As everyone knows, we've been planning a return of students to a greater in-person learning, anticipating a decline in numbers and rollouts of the vaccination, a challenge that we are currently working through for 4-5. The 4th and 5th grade is that preliminary estimates show that we need to move approximately 30 students from one building to another in order for us to bring those kids back. This is directly due to the imbalance of capacity in our buildings. Reconfiguring would have allowed us to be more effectively, or to allow us more effectively distribute our students across 6 sections instead of 3 per building, creating an environment that supports social distancing and eliminates the needs for these students to move. That configuration would have also allowed us to slide one of those 6 sections to an online only section, resulting in 5 teachers teaching in person and 1 teacher online, thus eliminating the need for teachers to take on the monumental task of Zooming and delivering in-person instruction simultaneously. It would have also eliminated our need to impact our MTSS program due to us reassigning our reading specialists to classroom teachers. It would have aided us in so many other areas, such as lunch specials, enrichment, and support services. However, as everyone knows, hindsight's 20/20, and all we could do is learn from the past so we don't repeat it in the future. There's still much uncertainty with this pandemic. Mrs. Holman and I Continue to have discussions as recent as last week with LVHN and the Department of Health regarding COVID projections, vaccination plans, and their thoughts for next year. They all suggest that although our county COVID numbers are declining, they have a high level of confidence that social distancing and mask wearing will be in place to some degree next year. Other considerations that were identified, in addition of other considerations that were identified were the addition of a building transition and less opportunities for K2 students to have older buddies and K3 students to see 4th and 5th grade performances. Finally, we recognize and understand that a reconfiguration will create an impact for families as evident by the parent survey sent out in May of 2019. Although the educational benefit to students ranked highest in the top priority for the board to consider, the impact to families was a close second. Areas of concern voiced in the survey were the overall impact to families, transportation, distance between buildings, having 2 kids in separate schools, and older siblings not riding the bus or being in the same school as younger siblings. These are some of the legitimate concerns surfaced by our families that we must consider in our future recommendation. The goal of our presentation tonight was to provide a summary of the work this district has already done in exploring this topic, in addition to highlighting findings that were identified as we navigated educating elementary students during a global pandemic. We are acutely aware of the challenges this unique school year has presented our students, staff, and community. However, those challenges do not eliminate our responsibility to ensure the important work of the district continues, in addition to exploring opportunities to weather such challenges more favorably in the future. We recognize topics such as this are sensitive and often difficult to discuss, but they are needed to ensure we continue to do what's best for students. As we continue to plan for the 21-22 school year, we anticipate that overcrowding at Northwestern Elementary will not go away and possibly be exacerbated if social distancing continues in the fall as predicted by our national, state, and local health officials. We also believe that an online instructional model will be needed into next year as well. I want to emphasize that this matter before us is not just because of COVID-19. This issue of an equitable balance between Northwestern Elementary and Weisenberg has been an ongoing matter for this district for many years, and it will continue to be unless a long-term solution is accepted. We still believe that it's in the best interest of our students and district to explore the potential of reconfiguration of the elementary schools in a K3, 4, 5 configuration for the 21-22 school year. Our intent in the upcoming weeks will be to re-examine this matter in greater detail, refresh and gather more data, and present to the board a recommendation with specifics at the April 7th meeting.
That's a lot of information in a relatively short period of time. Refreshing some conversations, but recognizing at least one and another board member is on the heels of that, trying to kind of take you back. We will certainly go over, as Dr. Sosnovic mentioned, some specifics. Our presentation on April will go over some of the class size projections, enrollments, and ultimately, as he said, an administrative recommendation moving forward. Our principals also have some logistical information about how it applies to class schedules and specials and special education, et cetera, that they will also present at that meeting and are preparing now. We also intend, and you saw on the slide, we intend to send a survey out to our families. We have it down for the 10th, which is next Wednesday, for families to give us some feedback about their intentions for the 21-22 school year in terms of what instructional models they would like for next year or they would prefer for their children. So we will use that data also to make some recommendations in the presentation. Does anyone have any questions we can answer or information you think need to be included in the presentation for next week that we did not mention? It's really informational, but
Again,
recognizing.
real quick. The development up north, up in New Tripoli, that was kind of proposed early on, and we kind of, that was what I think stimulated this possibly. Where's that stand now? Do you have any idea, or is that just done?
Last I heard from the township, it was on indefinite hold, and last I checked, although I haven't checked recently, it was for sale. The land was for sale.
So that development up there is nixed. They're not doing it anymore.
I will double check on a current status. As of last January or so, the Lynn Township said it was on indefinite hold, and then I saw it up for sale. So I would like to get you an update, but that was the last I heard.
Okay, thank you.
Problem. I'll get you an update. Unless Bill?
John, this is Bill.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
As you know, I'm on the planning commission for
Yes,
Lynn,
sir.
and that project hasn't come to a planning meeting in over a year now. And there's no activity that we see from that. There are only rumors about it being sold or for sale, excuse me. There are still issues with the treatment plant being able to handle the number of houses that were proposed to go into that area. So that is, that whole project is kind of on hold right now. We don't really know what's in the plan for that in the future.
Okay, thank you, Bill.
I guess I had a couple of points. I mean, I think you hit on some really key items, right? The potential here for, continued digital online learning, synchronous learning, and really, the fact that we don't want to see that 10 to 12% leave the district, right? We frankly can't afford to have that 10 to 12% choose options outside of what we have to offer. On the equitable resourcing, sort of addressing and focusing on the developmental needs of different groups, and you don't have to answer this now, but I think something that would be useful would be to have, I guess, some examples of the types of programs or the types. I think about some of the cohorts that might get formed when you have the combination of now the full class size, where you might have, just making up an example, right? But you might have 2 or 3 kids in one school and 2 or 3 kids in another, not enough to really financially address it or provide the level of developmental needs that cohort at any one school has. But now by combining that to one school, all of a sudden you now have a potential sizable group that you could, really address with some innovative and new programs. So I guess that's kind of just some examples of where we think that might take us as we go forward.
We could certainly put together a more comprehensive list. I'll give you an example, and it's exactly, I kind of laughed when you said it, an example I gave a parent yesterday who was asking about the accelerated studies option, not necessarily a gifted option, but just a student who needs to be challenged and is on the high end of the spectrum, and how we group students. And that was exactly the example I gave. The parent said, the student is in a group by themselves in the building they're currently in. And I said, well, the good possibility is the other 2 students that might be in that group are in the other school. And so there are some possibilities of some grouping. I think that happens most frequently in special education, where you are able to group students by ability or reading level or subject area, either in larger groups, which might not always be advantageous for special ed, or just more effective use of staff with groups of students. As well as in our gifted and our accelerated students, not necessarily students that are identified gifted, but students who need a challenging group and might need some of the enrichment opportunities. So every single one of our curriculum documents, textbooks, and standards has a continuum of options for differentiation. And our staff are masters in differentiation. That grouping is a part of the equitable distribution of the staffing, the resources, and the education to be able to do that effectively and in groups that are manageable for the staff person, but also good for the kids to have enhancement in that particular case. So that was an example I gave one of our parents yesterday about the accelerated studies option or comment that's in Dr. Susnovich's slide. But we'll certainly give you other examples. I mean, Title I is one that I briefly mentioned. Right now, Northwestern Elementary is a title building. Weisenberg is not the title building, is not a title building. When we did the original calculations last year, although you have to run it through a formula, we believe that both elementaries would then qualify because it would be an equitable distribution across both elementary schools. Certainly, all of our staff would be distributed differently, special education and gifted included. But we'll come up with some more concrete examples to give you examples. But the example you gave is exactly the one I mentioned this spring.
Did you say title?
A Title I building. So you get federal funds for Title I. We get.
Clarify what you meant by.
Yep, so, sorry, Title I is a federal program that right now Northwestern Elementary qualifies for. A few years ago, we had a waiver that allowed us to split the funds from both elementary schools. That's going back. My predecessor did it, so probably 2010 or so is when that ended. And so they are funds that we divert primarily for salaries and resources for students who are struggling. And right now, those resources and salaries are devoted entirely at Northwestern Elementary because they have to be. That's our building that qualifies for title programming. Now, we don't believe we would get additional funds, but it would be distributed differently. So we get somewhere in the area of $178,000 a year or something in title funds, but they would be able to be equitably distributed to the reading specialists and the programs through MTSS, which is what Dr. Susnovich mentioned, which is multi-tiered systems of support, talking acronyms a lot, which was, if you are a board member who's been around a little while, was RTII, like response to intervention. So we have tiers of students that are going through intervention processes. But thank you, sorry, I get.
That you don't qualify someone.
What was that?
What qualifies that ability to get title? You didn't say that.
Typically poverty solely. It's economically disadvantaged. Dr. Susnovich said clarify what a building qualifies for title or how they qualify. It is based on their poverty and their economically disadvantaged percentage in a state federal formula. Dr. Warfel?
I was going to make a comment similar to Mr. Liza's. I think on the slide that it's identified as educational. There are some things on there that are eminently clear and some that are not. So I think you said you were going to bring back. So for instance, under equity, all students will have access to the same. How is that different than what we have now? The next two are very clear to me. Understand them completely. Learning instructional benefits, the fourth target focused on developmental needs. We've already tapped developmentally appropriate education in the school district to a large extent. How is that different? How would it look different? Increases emphasis on learning to read and reading to learn. Similarly, that's a core aspect of our K-5 program. How would that look different in one building as opposed to two? Curriculum consistently delivered across grade levels. We have a consistent curriculum, well established and well supervised. How would it look different in one building? So I think that the next one to me is very clear, more flexibility in educational program, unify students early in the school career. Why is that? How, what does that look like? How is that different? So I think those details would be very helpful.
Could you tell us which slide you're looking at?
The one that says educational,
9.
Number 9? Could you put
the number?
Yep.
I'm sorry.
That's right. Yep, that one.
But you said you were going to bring back further detail. I mean, there are specific items that I think would be helpful to really show the strength of how that would be different in one building as opposed to.
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Warfel. So what we presented tonight was that summary from that January 2020 presentation. A lot of this language comes directly from that. And our intention for April 7th would be to provide specific examples of how we could realize some of those benefits if we would move in this direction.
And some I think you can skip. Some don't need nothing. It's weird. So.
Yeah, I have a quick question. So other school districts have gone this route that are similar in geographic region. And I'm curious, if you look 6 months to a year out and transportation is an issue for families that are concerned about the length of time on the bus, I'm curious to see how it is for them now. So those families that were concerned about transportation, And I'm sure the school district looked at innovative solutions to that to reduce the time, maybe keep families together as much as they can in routes. How is it for them, and can that provide us with some insights as we look, like almost a look into the future for a comparable school district that did do it? Because we know it's been happening a lot. And how is it working out for them 6 months, 12 months out?
Yeah, we will get you specific information, but one of the questions that was asked on the FAQs was what districts are doing this. They all have their little nuances. In terms of the distance of those buildings, you know, Whitehall Copley is an example of an extreme. They do a grade reconfiguration, but they're also all on one campus. And so there's some districts that can't be compared, and there's other districts like Southern Lehigh who does have some buildings that are further apart. That might be an equal comparison, but we did answer that about 20% of the school districts in the state have some form of grade band configuration. They're not all the same. However, the IU local district in IU 20 and 21 are Whitehall Copley, Northern Lehigh, Southern Lehigh, Pleasant Valley. Bangor started in 2019, so that's a rather new change. Delaware Valley, Penn Argyl, Nazareth, and Pocono Mountain all have grade band structures versus traditional. The other one that's been added to this list that is a change, it's not necessarily a grade band, it's actually Salisbury because they closed an elementary school. A little bit different situation, but we can certainly get some feedback. And Bangor would actually be the one I would want to talk to.
Thinking. It's very similar, you know.
And they started this in 2019. We did speak to them very early on about transportation and about their move to this model, but I don't know how they went into a COVID year then. So that's sort of overlay, but we will certainly get some of that feedback for you
from the parents' perspective. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Sosnovic, on slide number 8 under facilities and transportation, we have a bullet there about the projected increase in annual cost of $105,000 to add 2 additional buses and drivers. And did you make, this is just for clarification, did you make a comment that by relocating buses to Weissenberg, some of that cost would be deleted?
Yeah, so let me just make sure that we're absolutely clear. What we settled on in the last presentation was that 2 buses could be placed into the route, our daily rotation, that would afford us our 60-minute like threshold. However, we were also discussing at the time 4 buses for a maximum exposure of 105. So that 105,000 that you see on the slide is for 4 buses, not 2. So I wanted to make sure that we presented what we ended up discussing as landing on like 2 buses around 60 minutes, but also did not want to overlook the maximum exposure if we ended up doing 4 buses, which would further reduce the time of 60 minutes, which would be at 105. The $105,000 cost that you see there is already with realizing benefit if we did put those buses down at Weisenberg. So the cost was actually greater than that. If we would put them at Weisenberg, it landed approximately around $105,000. Now that was, a few years ago. And so Mr. Oakes has been working already looking through different scenarios to come up with closer cost projections with Mrs. Leffley, which we would plan to bring forward in April 7th as a refresh.
If you recall, questions about transportation at the time, the routes we would travel would be very similar, excuse me, to the middle school, high school routes. And I believe Mr. Oakes is on for the FMP, so he can certainly address this. But the routes are very similar to those that we travel currently for middle school and high school. We already traverse the entire district to pick up all of those students and bring them here for middle school and high school. It would be the traversing of the district to then go to Weisenberg. We already have many unloaded miles when those buses at 2 o'clock come up here. And so when they leave Weisenberg's depot, Art can tell me how many buses are down there now. When they leave, they're riding unloaded miles up here anyway. And so he envisions he would take the buses out of Weisenberg's depot to do the pickups and drop at Northwest Allen, and buses out of this depot to do the pickups and drop off at Weisenberg. You also know, as from the board perspective, we did install some plugs down there for some of the buses, but he's also invested in a number of gas buses that are also housed at Weisenberg that don't require the plugs. Which is why we can afford the ability to add additional buses there. Art, do you want to add anything to that?
No, Ms. Holman, you're correct, though. We do have 6 buses down there. 5 of them are now gas buses. 1 of them is not and is getting replaced in our cycle this year. So all of the buses down there will be gasoline buses. We balance between putting buses down there in that yard as far as exposure to not being fenced in, as far as having runs and closeness to proximity of not having unloaded miles as much as well. So at the moment, we sort of balance that between the 2 bus yards.
Miles for Mrs. Lister.
For Mrs. Lister's benefit, the unloaded miles is important because your formula for being reimbursed from the state does not count any miles you drive unloaded. It's always a little bit of a balance that Mr. Oakes does because the longer you have students on, the more loaded miles you have, which increases your reimbursement. But it's a balance of how long do you have them on because it's ride time. And as much as parents don't want students on buses any longer than they have to be, nor do we. We also have a really large district. And so some of our bus runs now run 60 minutes, not a lot, but some do. Last year when we ran this, because we had our kindergarten students at the time, we did run Mr. Oakes ran a full schedule. And so you could actually look up your child and see what your new pickup time would be and your new end time. That will be a little more challenging until we get our current kindergarten students, our incoming kindergarten students in. But we're pretty confident in terms of the routes because they're very similar to what we're already running for middle school and high school, just with a different drop at Westwood.
And Ms. Holman, just for a visual for the board members, just picture it in circles. We do not run straight lines. We don't directly leave from a school and go out on a straight line and drop the last kid off. Everything is done within a circle. So if we go out of Weisenberg Elementary and turn left, we drop the first kid off and we sort of do some version of a circle to where we come back on the right, and that's when the last kid gets off. So it's always in a circular motion for the bus routes.
And typically the last on is the first off.
Yeah, we try to do that as much as possible. There's sometimes where we can't, and we always balance safety. For the most part, we do as much door side as we can so that the kids are not crossing the roads. And we have to balance all of those things, but that is we intend to do that as much as possible. It's not 100%.
Now, when we tabled this discussion last year, it was before COVID came. And a lot of things have changed in the way we have to operate this past year. And we really don't know at this point how much of it is going to carry over into next year. That's something that I don't know that we can crystal ball with any accuracy, knowing what we know today. But I'd like to talk a little bit about this concept you had about 5 teachers in the class that would be by redistricting and combining grades. We would have 5 teachers that would be able to teach in person with 1 teacher teaching the virtual students. And that would be accomplished with the existing staff that we have. And at this point, until the survey is taken by parents and until we have some kind of an idea about if we can come back to school full time 5 days a week by the state allowing us to do that, there still may be some parents, some families out there who are reluctant to send their kids back to school for whatever reason. And I think maybe we'll pick that up in the survey. So it's a long question, but I'm trying to make some background to it. So if we move into next year and we still have distancing requirements by the state, currently it's 6 feet. We started out in the beginning of this whole thing back in March of last year with the requirement for 3 feet And we could of course, make that work a lot better than 60. You know, our rooms are just not big enough to handle a 6-foot distancing with all the kids that we have in our classes. So this idea of having 5 teachers teaching full-time 5 days a week for the kids that elect to come back full-time, we would still have the ability to have that one teacher to teach the virtual classes in that class. Is that correct?
Go ahead, you start.
Yeah, I'll start, Mr. Delacour. That's exactly right. I think one of the greatest challenges that we've had as educators was that fine balance of providing attention to students online and in person. No matter what, you're always dividing your time and you're always focused on one subset of students. And so we recognize this as a challenge moving forward. As you mentioned, there may be a potential for us to have online students. We believe that wholeheartedly, or online classes and students being online for a variety of reasons. One of them being that students themselves are not vaccinated. There's no trial runs for students at this age right now for any vaccination that we know of. So there's a strong likelihood for a number of different reasons that we're going to need to continue an online model. As Mrs. Holman said, you know, we're looking at anywhere between, I think she mentioned 12 to 15% of our elementary students now being online. So what we struggle with is having our sections split between 2 buildings. And I'll just use easy math because I'll keep it easy for myself. So say we have 75 students in any particular section, our building, and we'll call them first graders. I could divide them into 3 sections of 25, no problem. But say that there's a number of those kids that want to go online. Well, I can't take one of those teachers and make them an online teacher. Say 20 of them want to go online or 10 of them. The math doesn't work and we would not be able to socially distance those students with the remaining 2 teachers. And we have to pull from other programs similar to what we did this year with our reading specialists in order for us to make online happen. Now, if we were in a grade band span for that grade or first grade teachers, we had all 6 of those sections at Weisenberg. We could combine the online students from Weisenberg and elementary in that grade 1, slide them to a single teacher who would teach them online, and the other 5 sections would not have to do Zooms, unless maybe there was a quarantine issue or something along those lines. So it really provides a greater level of continuity and attention and focus and sense of normalcy and how we really educate our kids that we have in the past moving in this direction. It provides us with that level of flexibility. We may not need it, but if we do need it, we don't have to come back to the board requesting programmatic changes and or requesting additional staff to accomplish this, because we will be able to do it with staff that are currently existing much more efficiently. That answers your question.
I think it does. So then if we would not reconfigure and we would continue status quo and we would be required to teach some virtual students next year, would we continue to have to do the 4-day hybrid classes?
That is one of the options. We're trying to plan for that now, and that's one of the intentions of the parent survey. We want to see where families are. This is not a survey that is necessarily a commitment. It's an idea of where our families are going to land next year so we can ultimately plan this out. If we are in a K-5 configuration, I could, and Mrs. Holman could support this, it will be a much greater challenge for us to move resources around without having impacts to other programs in order for us to leverage existing staff to provide that online environment. There will have to more than likely be some, if we don't have enough staff here and we're not willing to acquire additional staff, there will be simultaneous Zooms and in-person learning like there was happening this year. We don't think that is the best educational model. And so we're trying to set us up for, long-term success on a number of different fronts here. We don't know what the efficacy, well, we know what the efficacy rates of the vaccination are in the short term, but our health officials are also suggesting they don't know, and they don't have longitudinal studies that show how long these vaccines will last. That we've heard 90 days, we've heard maybe 120 days, but what happens when they go up? Do we need to be socially distant at 6 feet? Will we need to start to take other mitigation strategies? What if a new variant comes around? Again, this is not, and I know we're talking COVID, but this is not a COVID issue. This is an issue of capacity that was born out of Northwestern Elementary. It just so happens that we recognized as we looked at, we start to examine what we did this year, some really strategic advantages we could have realized had we been in this model moving forward.
Yeah, the percentage I was showing Dr. Novak at Northwestern Elementary, we have 84% in person and 16% online, and Weisenberg Elementary, 81% in person. I would also say, whether it is COVID related or not, the online component, I would put our teachers in the online component up against any cyber school in terms of live synchronous instruction and quality and rigor of any student we have. And so I also think that there are a possibility of existing students that we have that are online, but I don't know any cyber school that's doing 5 days a week, synchronous Zooms and synchronous instruction with teachers that we are. And so if there's a student that's struggling in a cyber school or a charter school, and they have a desire for health reasons, flexibility, any one of the host of reasons, we have an opportunity with one of our dedicated staff members who I would put up against any one of those programs.
I was just going to add to what Troy, or what you were talking about. I mean, the slide that you have on the screen right now, to me, is one of the most telling slides, aside from COVID, because you're looking at, a square footage of an elementary school at 57% larger with 7% less students. And now that you've said the number of, remote or digital only, it's actually worse. It's like 10 or 12% less students.
Yeah, that's total enrollment.
That's total enrollment. Yeah. So so clearly that on that page right there says we have a significant imbalance, which has to be addressed one way or another. And then that takes us to the path of how do you address it.
Do you have in your database the studies that we've done this year, how many students we can accommodate in each room for a 3 foot and a 6 foot distance? We have that. So we know how many students would have to be taught virtually in order to bring everybody back to the time.
Yes, our principals with our staff's assistants, our teachers' assistants, have gone through every room. They have every square feet of every room. They know how many students they can fit at 6 feet. They know how many students they can fit at 5 feet. They know how many students they can fit at 4 feet in most cases. Our teachers have been super creative about spaces for students so that students, if we didn't have to move them, we don't move them. The two kind of non-negotiables we said is like the kid has to be able to see the board, because you can put a kid so far up against the board, but he or she can't see it. And so that's like been the one non-negotiable. The kid has to be at a space where he or she can see the board. But they've been super creative. But yes, even our middle school and high school moving forward as we begin discussions, Dr. Novak mentioned 4th and 5th, and that continues to be. This is not a discussion 4th or 5th or reconfiguration. They're two separate discussions about two separate school years. As I said in multiple communications, we continue to plan for a phased return. I don't have a date for 4 or 5. Our elementary principals were trying to rectify one particular classroom that is small and has a high enrollment, which is where some of our students might need to move from one building to another, which involves a whole separate transportation route to get them there, and 30 phone calls to parents to say, we're going to have to move your child. And so we're really, we're working on that plan as late as today to try to rectify that one particular classroom, and then anticipate rolling out a message at some point soon about 4th and 5th grade with the dates to be determined, where they will return 4 days per week as well. transportation for the whole mass of them is already done, and Art did that. And then, certainly have already started conversations with middle school and high school to think about their classroom spaces. Our principals, Mr. DeVico and Mrs. Yadish, do have each classroom space, each identified by square foot, how many students they can fit at 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet, how many students are currently enrolled, and how many students, if you take the online students who don't need a space, out of the mix. Recognizing some of that fluctuates when we roll these messages out. Some students want to come back and some students go online, but it's been about net neutral. We've had some shifts, but it's been about net neutral. So yes, they have all those plans and have worked, begun to work with the faculties at middle school, high school, began to work with the faculties about what that looks like. And, there's some things that you can't consider, like science lab tables, which are stationary, cause some issues. Some of our art rooms with the stationary tables are challenging. Not impossible, but require some interesting solutions. Some of our labs that continue to have stationary computers. So we've been really creative about, potentially moving, potentially different furniture, all those things in just the effort to return them to school. Because we, as I've said multiple times at this table, all of our staff, all of our administrators, and I know you do as a board, value the value of in-person learning. And that is the best place for our students, and our staff believe that, our teachers believe that, our administrators believe that, I know you do too.
Okay, any other questions from board members regarding the presentation we saw, or any requests that you would like to have brought back for the next time we talk about this? No? We used up an hour with that. Try.
It'll probably be
That's good.
It'll probably be the longest of the three. The other two,
A lot of good information
It
here.
is.
And again, the study, when we left this a year ago, we didn't have COVID, so now we have some other things to think about that we have to integrate into the decision we're going to make about reconfiguration. So if there are no other questions or comments about this topic, we'll move on to the next item, or the two calendars for 21-22, the school year, or the school calendar and the support staff calendar. Anything you want to mention about that? We'll approve this next in 2 weeks.
that would be the plan, unless you have any questions. Lehigh County superintendents did meet with Dr. Rushton at LCTI. As you know, we always try to coordinate our in-service days and maximize our opportunities for our LCTI students. So if LCTI is open, we try to get them there and coordinate our days, because LCTI has a formula by which they are open or closed, depending on the districts that are open or closed. It is a very similar structure to this year, similar similar in-service days. They're all in person. Similar in-service days as last year. I'll certainly take any questions that you have, but it's very, very similar to last year. We will be beginning school if you approve this on August 30th.
Okay, we'll take action on the two calendars in 2 weeks. Now, under policy, we have one first reading of another non-discrimination policy. Dr. Sisnovi, would you just introduce that to us, please?
Yes, I will. And actually, I'm going to pass the baton over to Mrs. Matika because she did the work on this policy.
Good evening. Thank you. The district currently does have a policy addressing non-discrimination for qualified students with disabilities, and that is policy 103.1. But the current policy does need to be updated to address the recent changes in the Title IX federal regulations. So the policy before you tonight has been updated to comply with the Title IX qualifications, as well as a structure for addressing a complaint. The policy has been legally reviewed before we post it on the agenda.
Okay, this policy will be up for review for 30 days. Is there anything you'd like to add, Doctor?
No, sir.
Okay, then under 3.02, we have three policies that will be up for approval for second reading in 2 weeks from now. Have you heard any comments about them?
I have not.
Okay. And then if we approve the three new ones, we will have to rescind one policy that will be superseded. Under operations, let's get into the facility master plan update.
I will just start and then turn this over to Mr. Oakes, who certainly knows this better than I. This is our annual update. Every couple of years, we do a major master facility plan where the architect presents every year annually. Mr. Oakes and subsequently Mrs. Frisbee on the finance side put together the upcoming projects that you can look at in the next couple of years. He will talk to you about one immediate project that we will be asking for your permission and approval to bid in April. Others, as you know, they will come to you as those projects come up for, permission to bid or permission to go out for those projects. But I will turn it over to Mr. Oakes, who is on, and Mrs. Frisbee.
Thank you, Ms. Holman, and I'll start it. And again, I'll talk about all of the things that we need to do or that are on our list, and then Ms. Frisbee will talk about how we pay for them. That is her department, so I don't try to venture into there. If you can go on to the first page there. So just in the basic agenda here, we're going to recap the projects. The projects, we shortened this up a little bit to 23-24 school year because going out much further than that is just an unrealistic goal. This is a much more concise look, and it's very familiar as far as what we've done in the past with the last couple of years, as we just sort of tabled some projects anyway. So we're just kind of recapping what the last few years have been. Our roof management plan is on here. Leslie will talk about the funding plan, and then we'll talk together, either one of us, about the recommended steps going forward. So just to summarize, so everyone knows on the board what we've done in the last couple of years here. We did do the stadium improvements. The numbers that you see here, I don't need to repeat them. They're directly from Leslie's books. So that's exactly what we spent dollar for dollar right out of her budget plans and her reconciliation of the bills. The middle school gym, if you remember, we removed the flooring because there was potential asbestos in the flooring, and we put in a wood floor in the middle school. We did do our phone upgrade system. We did a water tank replacement. That was in the high school. Fixed some sewer repairs. That also was in the high school as well. We recently did our bipolar ionization. That is district-wide. Outside, we did the baseball and softball field renovations where we upgraded the infields of both of those. We did some COVID repairs, some COVID-ready things in our nurses suites for the buildings, and that was district-wide as well. And we have an annual roof maintenance plan that we continue to fund. That is basically a check of all of our district roofs and some minor maintenance repairs.
Art, can I stop you right here a minute?
Yes, sir.
Could we talk just a little bit about the bipolar ionization for any folks who are with us tonight that might not be familiar with that project, why we did it and what it does for us, please?
Sure. So the bipolar ionization is a device that goes in to every HVAC unit that we have. So any heating, ventilation, or air conditioning unit that we have that processes the air in our occupied spaces. So all of the classrooms, all of the gymnasiums, the libraries, the offices, it goes right into the unit. So whether it's a univent, which is on the floor, a rooftop unit up on top of the roof of the building, or even a ceiling mounted, ventilator that brings in the heating and the cooling air. And basically what it does is it creates these ions that essentially make particles in the air larger. They make particles combine, then they get trapped into the filter and they eliminate those particles. And also an ancillary benefit of that, what they do is they sort of change the way that I'll say viruses react and bacteria reacts, and it sort of makes them inert, and it doesn't allow them to be spread. So it actually improves our indoor air quality vastly. It's been proven to greatly reduce the amount of COVID and H1N1 and the regular, flu virus across, and colds and mold bacteria, mildew, those type of smells. It reduces them drastically within your occupied spaces where we have them. So we essentially did this district-wide to help get our buildings a little bit healthier for the return of our students and our staff. And I hope that answers sort of everything you're looking for.
Yeah, Art, I just want to emphasize that it does kill that virus in the buildings to make the air quality a lot cleaner in these buildings than it is outside or any place else you're going to go that doesn't have the bipolar, units in their HVAC systems.
Yep, it basically improves our indoor air quality from top to bottom, as if you had a much better filtration system in place instead of just your standalone unit. So drastically reduces the I'll say pathogens or viruses, bacteria, any of that stuff that's in the air. It will reduce it as soon as it crosses over that uniband.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Art, can I jump in there quick?
Of course, yes, sir.
The nursing suite renovations for COVID, are we able to tap into any of the money that we were able to get?
I will actually let Leslie answer that if it was used that way.
Yep, so I can take that one. We were able to fund some of that, not the full amount, but the amounts that were within the purchasing and procurement guidelines for the renovations as well as the materials, in addition to some of the furniture that was purchased for those nurses suites. So I'm going to say probably about 95% of that cost was funded through grants.
Thank you.
One additional question, Art, clarification on the middle school gym project, the reason?
Yeah, Art, you said
You
of
said
asbestos,
asbestos?
it was mercury.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I apologize. It was not asbestos. It turns out that there was some studies done on the rubber gym floors installed in the time that the middle school was built, and there may be a potential of mercury within them. And so they were recommended that they were removed instead of remediation, because there's really no remediation methods to eliminate it while it's in place. The only thing you can do is actually remove that rubber gym floor. Then you retake a test, make sure there's nothing present, which there wasn't, and then we installed a wood gym floor. Sorry, it was not asbestos. It was mercury.
I thought asbestos raises a different level of concern, so clarifying.
Thank you. I apologize about that. Thank you. Okay. We'll go to the next one then. Yep. So this is this slide, and this is going to look familiar for some and new for others. But basically, what this was our projects that were presented basically for right before COVID, and some of the things that we were working for. The middle school HVAC, as you know now, the middle school is what is it, 28, 29 years old almost. The HVAC system as a whole is reached its lifespan, and it needs to be replaced. And what that means is that the units itself are just outdated. The control system, we've done a lot of things to make it as efficient and as effective as we can. However, it does not last forever, and it is time before something, breaks, or we can't fix it, or we have to piecemeal a whole bunch of equipment together. It would be a perfect opportunity to go forward. We were working with McClure under an ESCO project to actually make this happen at that time, and then we sort of just tabled it. Middle school auditorium as well, which was on here. So I'm going to put that together with middle school auditorium, the site work, the middle school configuration of the LGI room, the middle school sprinkler system. We were working with Alloy 5, Randy Galliotto, if you remember, our architect, basically coming up with a plan on how to upgrade that auditorium space. As you know, with the gym floor was done in the middle school gym floor. We were also going to upgrade we talked about the bleachers and the backstops and things in there. We did some of that stuff. We need to finish that. The middle school auditorium involved putting some ADA ramps in, putting in some new seating, upgrading the sound system, the lighting system, the wall coverings, and basically bringing it to current design standards. The sprinkler is up in our wood loft ceiling. You can't see it. It's up above the wood trusses in the middle school, and it needs to be upgraded to something that does not freeze up there in the cold. It is not a heated space. However, it's a dry sprinkler system up there that has developed a few leaks. So you need to get up in there and replace it. And some of the site work is outside of if you're familiar with the kitchen area where you come in the back door there by the cafeteria, just on the corner of that auditorium door, as if you were coming in for an auditorium event. The sidewalks there, the outside of that vestibule was going to be sort of renovated as well, because that aluminum facade is a little disrepair. That was all one entire project that was also being looked at as well. Combine them together, and their total estimated cost, as you see there, $9,182,000. just to touch on the one thing that I did not touch on there, district-wide building envelope. This is on every year, and this is something that we continue to put forth with our budget. Leslie can talk about where it's budgeted at later on in one of the slides, but basically this is for anything that we need district-wide for building envelope facilities, anything that comes up from a driveway to a new door, something that has to be funded that's a little more than in our regular standard budget. Anything you want to add to that, Leslie?
Yeah, I think the only thing to add as we get through the next slides, we have renamed that instead of district-wide building envelope. We've renamed that. You'll see district-wide smaller capital projects. And I think when we are, and I talked about it and we looked at kind of the project list and what that entailed, some of those projects, like he mentioned, like driveway repairs or concrete repairs, kind of are outside the scope of what you would think as traditional building envelope for caulking and sealing windows or brick joints or things like that. So it's basically the same allocation of the funds. We're just expanding the use to try to identify and kind of cross off the list some of those smaller projects and repairs that we need district-wide.
Yeah, if anybody remembers that's been on the board back to prior to Alloy 5, we had KCBA do a feasibility study for us, and within their analysis with Dewey Engineering, it identified some brick pointing and some brick walls and some concrete stuff, and that all fell under a district-wide building envelope is how they called it. And so that's sort of where that name came from. And as Leslie referred to, we just sort of upgraded it to the next slide. And we can move on. And that was really just a recap. So as we go forward, as always, there's something that comes up that is unexpected. And this year it's the middle school main water line replacement. Again, district-wide smaller capital projects. That's the money that Leslie was just referring to. There is some driveways in need of repair right at our entrances. As you know, the buses are just torture on them in addition to all the traffic we get. Some of our sidewalks, some things that we have. The maintenance building, which is MB, that is the diesel pump. That's a combination that Leslie, Jen, and I keep going back and forth about because I keep pushing for a fuel tank. Either way, we still need to upgrade our diesel pump, our current existing diesel pump. And the way that it's set up does not meet current DEP standards. We're able to get a pass every year by doing some testing and some third-party testing of the line that's underground. But it is something that sooner than later we need to address. And it keeps getting pushed off, but it keeps getting put back on. So that is why you see it here this year. Now, the main water line replacement, that's something that we're going to bring forward to you for next month to actually happen in this summer because it is leaking, and it's our main water line from the middle school, and the well is down by the stadium. So basically behind the home bleachers is our wellhead, goes all the way across the field, up around the building and into the boiler room. And we're proposing to bring it sort of straight across into the building and then down to the boiler room as a direct replacement. Any questions on this slide? Because this is really reflective of this year we're currently in.
And I'm correct in that the main water line replacement is the one project that will be their first decision point in terms of putting that out to bid as early as next month so that we can hit the summer timeline.
That is correct. And that's the one we're focusing on getting drawings for now. We really haven't gotten drawings for the other two. That there's something that we work on as we go along. But the main water line is something you will see next month at the board meeting. And that budget estimate comes in conjunction from Alloy 5 and working with Rob from Alvin Butts, who is our current CM manager. Okay, next. So as we go forward to the next year, 22-23 school year, we have on here our middle school roof replacement, which is a continuation and working with Tremco. There's a couple numbers that have been out there for that. There's the $2,445,000. There's some debate that we've even had at board level as to how can we save some money on that. There's two trains of thought. We can change the look of the building and we can give it a refresh, maybe with a metal roof, replacing it with a standing seam metal roof instead of all those shingles. I think that's the preferred method and the recommended method. If we go with that, it's a little bit more cost in the neighborhood of around $500,000 more. Otherwise, we stay with shingles and do it as a direct replacement. As you know, that middle school roof has been plagued with issues from the start, whether it's from warranty claims, dormers that used to be on there had to be torn off, re-roofed at certain times. We continue to patch it, but there's certain valleys and gutters and areas that are in disrepair. We just had an ice dam happen. To your knowledge, I don't know if it was on a board report yet or not, but we're working through that back in the music wing. So we have some issues with that roof that need to be addressed, and they are on our roof management plan that we present as well. I think Leslie presents it too with the budget, some of those numbers. Any questions on this slide? And this is not locking you in just on that slide. This is not locking you into those projects. I know it's $11 million. That's where we put that middle school project, the HVAC system and the renovation. That has to be discussed. There's some timelines at the end that if that's something that you really wanted to consider, as you know, we don't have the budget for that. That is something I think, Leslie, we would have to borrow for. If you decided to do so, we certainly need some time to put a project like that out on the street. That would be something that we would discuss super early, probably in the June, July, August timeframe. Okay. There we go. As far as 23-24, some of the things that we talked about, and this is also working with Ally 5, is that high school cafeteria renovation. And what that was is some of the sight lines within that building, trying to open it up to better sight lines, a little bit better flow, and some functionality. And again, that last section, it's called high school cafeteria, but it's basically that whole lower section. That is that last section of the high school that hasn't been touched in years as we've gone through the renovation projects. A lot into that. I don't have a lot of details because we haven't really delved into a plan for that other than a 30,000 foot view. As we get closer and we decide to actually go forward with this, then we look at contracting with Ally 5, we would come up with a much more consolidated plan for you to view in presentation form. Okay, that's 23-24. We go in the future, we just want to keep these on the radar, just for you to have on your sheet as well. So the field house to be determined. The reason that we keep that as a placeholder is that the field house roof is certainly something that is in disrepair and needs consideration. And if we're going to spend money for the roof, then I would say that solidifies that we're not doing anything with the building. And that's certainly something that has to come at board discussion within the next year or so to decide whether we're replacing that roof or not replacing that roof. What are we doing with that field house as far as we go forward? Bathroom renovations, this is just at Weisenberg. This was the number just as a placeholder for you. If you did decide to put those kindergarten bathrooms, if we went forward with elementary reconfiguration, that was our budget estimate to install those 4 bathrooms down there in the Weisenberg classrooms. If you did not decide to do that, the Northwest Cafeteria Expansion Serving Line was the other consideration. That's $532,000. If you decide to reconfigure, that one is really not even necessary. There is some line issues there, but it's not even remotely that kind of number. Again, we keep our annual $100,000. And then we have the Northwest Elementary roof replacement. And that's something to keep on as well. That's certain sections. And I think that's actually the high school, not Northwest Elementary. It's the high school. We have the high school broken up into various sections, and there are certain sections that are up on warranty, and we have some options that we'll look at as we get closer to that. But it's a big number if we had to replace it. Okay, any questions on that?
The only thing I would add is, the field house is on there and the field house is on here for a roof, and this is not a decision point for any time soon. But at some point, we'll need to have a conversation about the field house because we don't want to proceed putting a roof on a building you're going to do renovations to. And so we just need to go one direction or another. Again, it's not going to be anytime soon, but the field house and the field house roof are both on the plan at some point.
Yeah, and you'll see on the next slide, and then I'll basically turn it over to Leslie. This is our roof management plan that we work with Tremco. As you see there, just on that line 2122 for the field house, pole building, and ops. So when the operations building was built, the garage was left existing roof. So that's where that ops building comes in. Then you have the pole building, which is down in the stadium as well. That's the pole building that's flat on the parking lot that basically is used by the maintenance department. And as well, I think drama has some stuff over there on the end bay. That roof is in disrepair. We've had many leaks. Some of the plywood is bad. That's kind of bad as well. And then the field house, but that's a big number. That's $300,000. And that's a lot of money. And a big portion of that is going to be the field house that we have to decide what to do. So again, we have that on our roof management plan as 2122. We can certainly modify our roof management plan with Tremco and push things out. They sometimes become more costly. They sometimes damage underneath the roof. You know how that goes. We work with them and they work with us as far as our budgetary constraints. But as far as paying for it and what this roof management plan, as far as funding is, I'm going to turn that over to Leslie because she'll be able to explain what those dollar amounts mean for you.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I have a question before Leslie jumps in on 6. You said it here around the roof renovations as it relates to the field house, but on 6, you talked about the middle school roof, the HVAC and the renovation. Is the reason that you have all of these here in 22, 23 because they are also tied to one another?
That is correct. So we put everything together on there as a potential borrowing, I'll say, and I think that's what Leslie could talk about better, but it was as a potential borrowing effect if we decided to go forward with that middle school project. Maybe we could put together some funding that we have and borrowing, keep it under maybe a bank loan under that 10 million. I don't know. That's where Leslie would talk about, but that's why they're together is basically for that. That middle school roof, we continue to repair it as needed. And that's one of those things that we could stretch it probably to whatever amount we need to. However, we're just continuing to repair and stretch and fix valleys. And we've spent some $10,000 on the one repair, $3,000 here, $4,000 there. So we spend money on that roof for sure, but that's a giant number to absorb.
Mrs. Lipster, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just gonna say on the previous slide that says capital projects future for Weisenberg bathroom renovations, there's an asterisk that says dependent on elementary reconfiguration discussions, decision. Can you add to that asterisk, bathrooms not mandated? So we know, looking back at it in future discussions, that that's an option, but not a mandate.
That is correct. There's no rule that says that kindergarten rooms should have a bathroom. It's standard building practices in schools, but it is not a requirement by any means that a kindergarten room has a bathroom within the room.
Mrs. Garlett is on, but the other thing I would mention is the classrooms that would likely be our kindergarten classrooms at Weisenberg are very close to an already existing bathroom as well. So if the board decides to obviously not do that, it's not mandated, it does not have to happen for those students to move down to Weisenberg. And the bathroom next to the cafeteria is very close in space to their hall, would likely be across the hall. But thank you, Mrs. Lister.
Yes, yeah, that is correct, though. It is not a requirement. I don't want to pretend to know what the educational, that a teacher on the educational side would say about a bathroom in a classroom, but it is not a requirement. And as Ms. Holman said, there is a bathroom right there, really close by to those classrooms. Jill, do you want to say anything about that? Or are you good? Anything to add?
Just that you are correct. The rooms that would be slated for kindergarten would be directly across from those bathrooms, so they would be in close proximity.
Yeah, and I would say that during that planning process of that, Ms. Burlett actually planned it that way so that we could utilize that space. However, it is on there as a cost if we decided to do it. Thank you. Any other questions that I can answer before we get into funding? Okay.
Okay, I'll take it over from here. So Art talked a little bit about this roof management plan. And so the way that we have structured this is, as we are aware, there's a general fund transfer that we budget annually as part of our general fund operating budget as a plan transfer into capital reserve. The capital reserve fund is a completely separate fund, can only be funded through a general fund transfer. And has to be used for expenditures relating to capital projects, fleet replacements, or there's an old thing in there for technology labs, which obviously we know no longer exist in that form of a hard, a lab with computers, desktops, things like that. So within our capital reserve, we have funds earmarked for both regular capital projects, and you'll see on the following slides that I break out those dollars, as well as dollars earmarked for roof management plan. So this is the funding plan that you'll see here, the second column from the left. You can see annually we have committed, and for the last few years, committed to $300,000 of a transfer. So that's part of the overall transfer that at the end of June, the board officially approves the transfer of those funds. We transfer the cash from the general operating fund to the capital reserve fund, and then earmark, earmark those funds for future use. So you can see in previous funding, we have about $600,000 earmarked for roof replacements. And as you can see, if we commit to the $300,000 funding mark in the near future, going out to 24-25, we have a cumulative total of about $2.1 million. Then on the next column where it says expenditure, Art and I work with the vendor Tremco, I believe it's Tremco, on the roof management plan. And we look at this and we update this annually. This plan talks about roof warranty extensions and what can we do to repair, what can we do to extend the life. And so we look at that plan and try to reallocate and push out where we can into fiscal years to give us a little bit more time to try to build up that funding so that if and when that time comes where we need to do a full roof replacement, we have the available funds within the capital reserve. Now, the one exception or caveat to that, you can see the asterisk on my slide, would be the middle school. So as you can see, based off of the current roof replacement funding plan, we have about funding requirements of about $4 million. And so, as we go through 24-25, you'll see we only will have about $2.1 million earmarked within the roof management plan. Doesn't mean there aren't additional dollars in capital reserve or through use of fund balance, but specifically earmarked for roofs, we would be short. And so to go back to, I believe, Liza's question, a couple of slides back on the fiscal year timing of the middle school roof, our recommendation would be that if the board would proceed with any type of middle school project that would require a borrowing, that we would borrow money and put the roof replacement into that same borrowing, whether it occurs in the fiscal year planned, another subsequent fiscal year, but knowing we do have a shortfall to address in funding roof replacements moving forward. Any other questions on the roof management plan? I'll get into some of the other funding plan then for the rest of the projects.
I just want to add, Leslie, as well, for that one that we talked about earlier at the high school there. What we do is we actually test the roofs and then we see if they're eligible for an extended warranty, which that number comes completely down then from that cycle as well. And then there's also sort of a refinish of the roof. So there's a lot of versions that as we get closer to the end of those warranties, we revisit, which is why we utilize this plan every year. We look at it and try to reset the numbers accordingly for budgetary purposes.
Okay, next slide, please. So this is the financing plan for board members who have seen this before. This is the same format that we've used. So we have several different funding sources for capital projects. So the first is, like I talked about before, the capital reserve fund. So that is funded through general fund dollar transfers that we do on an annual basis to build that balance up so that when we have projects, we have the capacity to pay for that out of existing funds without having to go and borrow money. As I talked previously, that capital reserve is really broken into two categories: capital reserve for general projects, and again, those would be capital projects. So that's not small repairs and maintenance or smaller projects, but really things that are capitalizable, $20,000 and above in a total project cost to meet the requirements for use of that fund. The other second part is the capital reserve, the roof management plan that we previously discussed. The third column there is the capital projects fund. I know they all sound similar. However, capital projects, that fund is funded through bond proceeds. So, the balance that you see there are the leftover bond proceeds from the high school project a few years back. And so we have requirements as to how those funds can be utilized. As you recall, we write those bonds anytime we borrow money to leave them really open-ended to address any facility needs for capital projects. So within those bond funds, it did not say they had to be used on high school projects. It said we could utilize those funds on any capital projects district-wide. The next category is available general fund balance use. As you recall, we do have an amount earmarked within the general fund balance in the assigned category for use of capital projects. One of the reasons that we've done this, and we've had this for several years, is leaving it within the general fund balance creates more flexibility. Once we transfer those dollars into the capital reserve fund, we lose the ability to reallocate those for other uses. And so although our intent is to utilize some of those funds for capital projects, we do have flexibility to use those for somewhere else. And when you look at collectively that $3.2 million, that's a combination of the capital projects assigned fund balance, the energy stabilization funds, as well as some unassigned fund balance. So that's really the total which we've assessed and said we believe this would be appropriate use for capital projects out of that use of fund balance. So in totality, as of July 1st of 2020, we had we've identified about $5.4 million of available funds for capital projects. As you can see then on the left-hand side, as you go down through the funding year, we look at the additions. So we know we have that annual capital reserve transfer, as well as the LVHN sponsorship. So if you remember correctly, that annual sponsorship, which is the combination of the cash donation as well as the equivalent cost that we are saving on trainer services, we are transferring that on an annual basis into capital reserve and earmarking that for the turf field replacement, 10, 12, 13, 14 years as we get down the road. So on the expenditure side, then you'll see the $40,000 coming out, as well as the $25,268 coming out of capital reserve. Those are the projects that we're funding out of that capital reserve for this current school year, or planning on for this current school year, as well as you go over, you'll see the $332,000 for those HVAC bipolar ionization units. We committed to paying for those out of the capital projects fund, the remaining high school project funds. So then you can see as we get to the bottom then, although I'm adding the $71,000 from the LVHN sponsorship, I'm also removing that amount to make sure that we've identified that that is earmarked specifically for stadium replacement in the future. And so this is what our financing plan looks like for 2021 for our capital projects. So when we get to June 30th of this year, I estimate the balances in these funds to be that bold number at the bottom. So we'll have a little less than $1.3 million reserved for general capital projects in the capital reserve fund, $900,000 earmarked for roofs, $143,000 leftover high school project funds, and then that remaining fund balance, which obviously can fluctuate year to year based off of general fund budget. Next slide, please. And so then this is just basically year two of that funding, following that same pattern, looking at what will be added through the general fund transfers to the capital reserve fund for both roofs and general projects. If you look back to the project list that Art presented, you'll see those amounts correspond with the project list. And so this just shows the corresponding fund that we would recommend taking those project dollars out of. As you can see, the $314,000 in the roof management plan, that would be the first tier of anticipated roof repairs from that roof management plan above. So at the end of June 30, 2022, we estimate still remaining balance to be in that capital reserve fund of about $1.3 million, $886,000 associated with roof replacements. And at that point, we would have estimated to exhaust the remaining high school project funds. One thing to keep in mind is we do have a time frame as to when we have to utilize bond funds. And so we do need to exhaust those funds within a certain period of time for different compliance and reporting requirements. And so our plan would be to utilize those funds within the next 2 years to get that balance to zero for compliance. Next slide. Then the same funding plan, I'm going out into 22-23. You'll see at the end, estimated balance as of June 30th, 2023. The capital reserve for general projects would be estimated about $1.4 million. Roof replacements would be at that $941. And then in this year, if this is the year the board would choose to do a middle school project, we would recommend, because we don't have sufficient funds that we can look at internally, that would be the recommendation to do a bond. And so obviously we always like to do something at that bank qualified under $10 million. But for argument's sake, until we certainly would refine a project and know exactly what our needs were, we just took the totals and kind of made it work in terms of how much dollars we would need compared to the estimated expenditure. So you'll see that would be funded through a capital project fund, and that would be both the roof replacement and restoration, the HVAC, as well as any renovations, and we would call that a middle school project. Next slide. And then the financing plan for 23-24 again follows that same structure. You can see the ending balances as of June 30th, 2024. We're still maintaining, because we are annually funding through that general fund balance transfer, about $1.6 million. By roofs, by that time, we'll have about 1.2, a little less than 1.3, and then remaining fund balance. The schedule here does anticipate that if we would proceed with that high school cafeteria project, we would propose using fund balance dollars for that. Again, these are just preliminary best guesstimates, looking at our funding, looking at what makes sense to fund out of the different categories. Obviously, we revisit this on an annual basis. We look at updating and realigning those dollars where we see necessary. The other big caveat that I'll say that we talk about with this is, this is the plan based off of our, I'll call it status quo budgeting strategy to fund these projects. So if through budget discussions, we talk about reducing the transfer to capital reserve or even eliminating that reserve, that may, on one hand, help the budget shortfall and the general fund operating budget. However, it creates a problem on the back end for how we accomplish and continue to fund these ongoing projects. And that's a discussion that, we can have and we'll talk about through the annual budget process and make recommendations. And if it comes to that, where we would recommend a reduction to the plan to transfer, then we would have obviously a plan on the back end to say, if we reduce that, what does it look like moving forward in the future for capital projects, and how we would look to strategize and fund those moving forward. Next slide. Any questions on the flow of that, why we are projecting use of certain funds over other funds? Mrs. Lister, I know some of this is new to you. If you have specific questions as to those funds, or anybody for that matter.
Leslie, when will you connect the dots? Because this funding plan looks great on the surface, and it's very balanced, and there's this $11 million that arrives at our door and makes everything work nicely. When will you show us the rest of this picture? Is that what's coming? That shows us there's some negatives in other areas of the budget?
Yep. So we'll talk about that part of the budget and how that plays into the capital projects funding in the budget discussion. We'll talk a little bit about it tonight. Our focus is mainly on revenues and COVID expenditures and grants. However, as we proceed through the budget process, we'll kind of bring it all together and talk about those proposed cuts and the implication of what those mean, whether they be operational and how it relates to this plan, or obviously educational as it relates to the operating budget. So for purposes of this presentation tonight, this does assume that in 21-22, we would budget the transfer of $551,000 of a general fund transfer to capital reserve to fund this plan. It may look like something different when we get to June for final budget adoption, or it may not. We may be able to preserve that. It needs to see where it shakes out and falls on the list of priorities as we move forward. I don't know if that answers your question, Todd.
That's most of the Act 1 tax increase. Thank you, Leslie.
Okay. And then next steps, I can certainly talk a little bit about the timeline. Art's probably better equipped to talk more about the details of what that means in terms of project design. We sat down and we mapped out, it's easy to throw these on paper for which fiscal year they're going to be paid for out of and planned on. However, there's a lot of work and preparation to get us to that point, both at the board level as well as then for the planning and implementation. All right, I'll turn it over to you for that timeline.
Sure, yeah, and as you see here on this sheet for April, which is next month, you're going to be getting some drawings and documentation and probably some executions for contracts with some of the experts in the field, whether it be the engineers or for Alvin Butts. Approval to bid that middle school water line, we do want to get that on the street because we want to be able to do that in the summer. The fact that we have to cut off our water to the middle school during that timeline because of the excavation, we definitely have to do that in the summer when staff and students are not here. The potential elementary reconfiguration and renovations, as we talked about, if that's something that you wanted to do and you want to put those bathrooms down there, we need to get on that as soon as possible as well. So that's on there for April. And I know you will be discussing that regardless next month anyway. So that's certainly part of the discussion. As far as this year going forward, July and August, if you want to do anything with that middle school project whatsoever, whether we want to discuss the roof, whether we want to discuss the actual HVAC, the renovation projects, that'll have to start in July and August because we'll have to execute contracts with Alloy 5 specifically to start that process. And Alloy 5 will start that process. They did some preliminary presentations for us a while ago. We can certainly refresh that, bring it back to you sooner and take a quick look at it. But if you want to, if that's even a possibility or on the idea slated for the following year as Leslie presented, we need to get started on that in July and August to bring forward September and October approval to proceed. And what that does is that locks us into the dollars that's required for Alloy 5 to basically present a project to you in November and December. Again, they'll bring that forward. There's going to be a lot of revisions. There's going to be a lot of discussion on the actual scope of it. And as it gets finalized, that means we go out to bid in January and February. Those are pretty well set in stone if we want that project to be successful for a 2022 summer start. There was some discussion back when we were talking about that project of giving up the middle school auditorium for a certain amount of time. So some of those timelines can change a little bit and some of them can't because we have to get some of the work done in the summer when there's nobody in the building. So those are the basic upcoming timelines, and we'll certainly bring back the proper documentation to begin that discussion. And the board will then decide at that point whether we move forward or not. Basically, the next decision after the April board meeting will be that July and August. And that's going to be whether we contract with Alloy 5 to actually put together a project. That will obligate us to some funds. It does not obligate us to that project, however. Any questions on that?
If I could just add there, Art, I think the important thing to look at on this too, this timeline, is that this is the general timeline, regardless of when you would look to do a middle school project or any other large project for that matter. So if we're talking a middle school project in 22-20 or 23-24, this would be the same timeline, just kind of pushed out a full year cycle. So I think, this isn't, it has to be this summer. This is if we proceed with a middle school project anytime in the future, this is what we believe is the appropriate timeline to plan that project accordingly.
Yeah, and as Leslie just said, even that middle or the high school cafeteria renovation, same thing. It's that same timeline. I basically need your approval to work forward towards a project, and then your final decision point is in that January, February. We have a set of bidding documents to you. You say yes or no to go out to bid, and then that's when the actual final decision. Of course, you always have the decision point once the bids come back, but at that point, we're obligated to at least pay for the architectural fees, engineering fees, whatever fees we're obligated at that point.
Okay, thank you. A good plan we have here. There's a lot of good stuff in here. Some things that I think might go away, but we'll see what it looks like in the next presentation, how this piece fits into the overall budget that we've been working on since January. So, thank you, Art and Leslie. And at this time, I turn it over to you again, Leslie, to keep going with the 21-22 budget. How goes it?
Okay, thank you. I think it's usually a rare occasion for me to say I have some good budget news. I'm very excited with how things are starting to come together. I'm looking at trending, looking at what we're looking at for next year. We still have a long way to go, but at least I feel like we're moving in a positive direction. And I'll share some of that, those details and that information with you in today's presentation. But definitely this is a positive presentation to deliver this evening regarding next year's budget. So the agenda for tonight, really going to just briefly recap those budget goals, talk a little bit about the budget summary, where we started or where we've come from back in January, making some assumption changes, moving the mark on some of those trending and local revenues numbers, and giving you some updated revenue assumptions. The other thing that we wanted to discuss tonight, we've talked a lot about COVID, we've talked a lot about the pandemic. Wanted to really pull that together for you and show you how we're dealing with that and how we're making that work with the budget. And so I have some information for you as to, the COVID related grants that we have been awarded and how we're working through those dollars and those grant projects, as well as the expenditure side of COVID and what we've spent to date. And certainly we have some ongoing costs that we anticipate through the rest of this year. And then I do have some updated 5-year budget projections at the end of the presentation to kind of pull it together and show, what the implication of making some of these revenue assumption changes, what that does to our 5-year projections moving forward. Next slide, please. So as we start off every budget presentation, really looking and saying, what's the focus of our goals this year? What are we focusing on programmatically? What's important to us? As we can get, it's really easy to get wrapped up in the dollars and cents and say we need to make cuts, we need to do this, but really trying to come back and focus on what are we trying to accomplish, and when we get into July 1st and the start of next school year, are we able to accomplish these goals and be proud of that budget and a sustainable budget moving forward to fit align with the goals in the strategic plan. Excuse me. Next slide. So just a brief summary of the 21-22 budget that we presented back in January. So back in January, when the board adopted the resolution to stay within the Act 1 index, that time we were estimating revenues, and again, as of January, of a little more than 44.7 million. At that time, total estimated expenditures were a little less than 48.5 million. That comes up with an estimated shortfall before any type of millage increase of a little more than 3.7 million. We know by passing that Act 1 resolution, our ability to raise taxes limits us to that 0.5160 mils, which would generate about $855,000 of new tax revenue. So if we, for argument's sake, assume that we would take that full tax increase, we have a revised operating shortfall of that little less than $2.9 million. So just wanted to kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we move through the slides to show what changes we've made from January to now as we work through finalizing that budget for next year. So, when I sit down and look at the budget and look at, I always jot down, like, what are the areas of uncertainty? What are the areas that we still need to address? And as we move through kind of those timelines when we can pinpoint when we're able to, nail that number down. This year, which we've talked about before, there's a lot of budget uncertainty, probably more so than maybe any year that I've been here. And so when I really sat down to think about what's making this year different, I came up with these items. And so, local revenue this year, the last 2 years, there has probably been more uncertainty with local revenue than we've probably seen in the last 20 years. Not understanding and fully knowing the impact of COVID, the economic environment, on real estate sales and transfers. And so, we've done a lot of work trying to watch what's going on in the community, working with Berkheimer, working with Portnoy to really try to identify what's an appropriate number for our local revenue as we move into 21-22. State and federal funding and grants. There's always uncertainty with the state level, but this year especially, the governor has come out and has a strong position for funding public schools, which is great. But, when you look at what does that mean and what does that take, I just don't know. There's uncertainty with what will we actually see for the actual funds flowing through us to us from the state for next year. On the federal funding, this uncertainty I think is a good thing. The uncertainty of not knowing how much federal funding we're going to receive. This year alone, we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, we received a lot of funding that we didn't anticipate. We know we have some funding that we can look to use in the next 2 years. We are hearing there's going to be more coming from the federal government. And so while that's all really good things, it also complicates the budget process because we need to plan for that. We'd like to be able to utilize that to plan and use some of those funds for existing expenditures to help offset our shortfall if we can, if the grant eligible uses allow for that. However, we also know that many times these grants come and they're supplement grants, which means you can't use anything that you've already planned and budgeted for. It's dollars above and beyond. And how do we plan for that? And how do we purchase that and appropriately, utilize those funds to, again, go back to our budget goals and accomplish what is our spending plan and our educational plan for the fiscal year. Change in student need, trying to address what are those additional supports and things we need to put in place for next year to help students, recognizing that this has been an unusual year. This goes back to, the COVID closures back in March. And so trying to assess what those needs will be, not only next year, but moving forward and potentially, not a one-time, two-year thing, but maybe perpetual. Change in student enrollment. We've talked a lot about charter enrollment. We've talked a lot about those, little less than 400 kids who are utilizing our fully online program with our teachers. And so as we plan for next year, what does that mean for our enrollment? How many of those students will come back into our classrooms? How many of those students will choose to leave our programs and go to cyber schools or charter schools, which we know is a significant amount of money to our budget. So really trying to pinpoint what is a good number to budget for in that category. Change in staffing. This is something that we obviously deal with on an annual basis, looking at retirements, resignations, how the change in staffing is going to affect the plan moving forward and how that affects our budget and the total dollars for salary and benefits. And then the final one, sustained COVID related expenditures. I think we're crazy to think that COVID is going to end and we're not going to have anything, any more expenditures associated with that. So really trying to pinpoint what's the appropriate number, what is appropriate to budget, what is appropriate to assume we'll get federal funding that will offset some of those expenditures. So a lot of budget uncertainty that we're trying to work through. We certainly don't want to just put buffers or placeholders in the budget. We want to make sure that we believe that those are going to be real expenditures or real needs or real costs. So really trying to pull that together, but this year especially has been challenging with trying to identify this as we get closer to June. Next slide. So here comes some of the good news. So as we look at local revenues, I went through the local revenues and as you all know, there's much more detailed information as to our line items for revenue, but these were the large categories that I wanted to pinpoint and really draw your attention to this evening. So current real estate taxes. So from January to March, what my recommendation is to restore about $285,000 to our current real estate taxes. And so that would be prior to any tax increase, prior to any new real estate tax dollars. But this would be strictly looking at our collection percentage. As you recall, in the 2021 budget, we had reduced that collection percentage from 96 to 95%, assuming that there would be an implication of COVID and that our taxpayers maybe would not be able to pay and we wouldn't see collections being as strong. As we finished out the collection period through the end of December, we did not see that happen. We saw very strong collections. One of the things that we did last year as a board, you decided to extend the discount period, eliminate the penalty period. And so, we saw strong collection even with some of those, the discount dollars extended and the penalty being eliminated. So looking ahead to next year, I believe now in January, I didn't know that. We didn't have the numbers finalized. I didn't see the closeout. I didn't see our delinquent tax at that stage. Now I'm confident that, our trends were very strong. And as we talk about delinquent taxes a little bit later this evening, you'll see our collections were very strong and we've turned over less to delinquent taxes than we have in prior years. And so I believe that it's appropriate to restore that revenue. I think it's a positive that it's restoration of that revenue, but I think the asterisk on that is that it's just that restoration. It's not new money. It's just restoring back to previous levels of collections that we have experienced in the past. And so it certainly helps our shortfall moving forward 21-22, but it's not new money. It's just restoration of existing money from prior years. Same on that earned income tax line item. So, we reduced the earned income tax back to the 2.26 based off of what I'm seeing in collections, based off of our discussions with Berkheimer. I do believe we will see collections pretty stable this year. Therefore, I'm restoring that line item for revenue next year to $2.5 million. I'm not anticipating increases. I think, it would be wonderful if we saw some increases, but again, restoration of that revenue, I think, is huge as we move forward for that 21-22 budget. Delinquent real estate taxes, you can see we're holding that at around $1 million. One of the reasons I haven't changed that is because we turned over less this year than we have in previous years. So, that tells me we're collecting it more in the current, and we'll see our delinquent collections dip a little bit next year. Interest earnings is really, at this point, we don't have any good information other than what we've had previously regarding what interest rates will look like. So we're holding that steady. We'll have conversations with the bank as we get closer to the end of the year. And if I can bump that or make changes to that in any way, I certainly will. And then other local revenue, you can see no change there. We're holding steady at about 1.6. That's going to be our interim taxes, our real estate transfer taxes, IDEA, which is a pass-through federal revenue from the IU, contributions, gate receipts. And so until we get to the end of the year and we see how we have some of those year-to-date collections, at this time, I didn't think it was appropriate to make any changes to those. So just in those two categories of current real estate taxes and earned income tax, the restoration of those trends from prior years allows us to increase total revenues of about $525,000. And so that would be a reduction to the shortfall. And as we talk about that budget summary and that budget shortfall, that is a true reduction to the shortfall because those are revenues that will be sustained and ongoing, hopefully into the future. You can see the note there just talks about the collection percentage and what we're assuming for real estate taxes. Next slide. State revenue, because of the uncertainty with the state revenue, not knowing what that's going to look like for next year yet. As we get closer, certainly we can refine some of those numbers. But at this point in time, I have not made any changes to the state budget. This is probably the negative part of all of this. The governor came out with his budget presentation and said he was going to increase spending to schools and that schools were going to get more money. However, based off of the governor's proposal, although it is a projected increase, compared to 18-19, for us and what we've budgeted would actually be a reduction. So at this time, because I don't know that that's going to happen or not, that the legislators are going to agree to the governor's proposal, I'm not reducing, I'm not increasing. We're going to leave the state revenue status quo at least for another month or two. Next slide, please. Okay, then federal revenue. So we have a significant increase in federal revenue, really primarily being driven by the grants. And so you'll see Title I, Title II, all of our title funds are holding steady. I did receive some revised allocations from Mrs. Stitzel earlier this week. All really just hovers around those dollars, not significant dollars, but certainly helps. Every dollar helps and counts for the budget. So really just no change there. As we get finalized numbers or better numbers or numbers that would be significantly different, I'll certainly update that as we get to the end. The PCCD federal portion. So this is an area that in the 2020-21 budget, we received, so current year, we received about $268,000 in PCCD funding. This year, it was funded through federal dollars, and it was reallocated from safety and security to COVID related. In prior years, it has been up in the state funding, specifically earmarked for safety and security. What we believe we can count on is that we'll receive some kind of PCCD funding moving forward. Whether it's COVID related flowing through federal dollars or reverts back to safety and security through state dollars. But I think we're fairly certain that will continue. So that $100,000 at this point is really a placeholder. I want to account for something because it is a significant dollar amount. However, we are increasing the expenditure side to offset and make that budget neutral. Because we don't know what that number will be. We don't know the eligible uses for those funds. And so at this time, we're assuming they would be supplemental funds for that spending. And then the ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 money. So the ESSER 1 money we received in the 2021 budget, that $140,000. The ESSER 2 money we received at this time a preliminary allocation. Our plan, and if you recall from last meeting, that is a 2-year funding grant of federal funding. So our plan would be to utilize half of those federal funds in the 21-22 budget and the remaining balance of those funds in our 22-23 budget. The other area that I haven't included, we are hearing there will be additional federal funding coming through, but there's some numbers floating out around there. I just don't know what those numbers will actually look like. So this time we have not included any monies other than the PCCD and the ESSER because they're either one, known, or two, assumed that we will receive something. So the increase to federal at this point is $400 and I'll call it $30,000. However, you'll see this amount does not go to reduce the shortfall, the budgetary shortfall. Because these are federal grants, because we haven't finalized the uses or the guidelines and we're working through those grant applications right now, we are using the assumption that those would be supplemental funds and so it'd be budget neutral. So although we're increasing revenues by $430,000, we're increasing expenditures by $430,000 as well. Our hope is to work through some of those grant programs, look at our funding plan, look at what we could potentially utilize in existing budgetary needs. However, we just don't have a good handle on that right now of what that would do or how much that would be to allocate. So that was the reason why we have made that budget neutral as of right now. Any questions?
Yeah, Leslie, do you think we will know if we're going to get these federal and state funds before we are required to vote on our final budget?
So the PCCD, no, I'm going to say we probably won't know that allocation. I'm pretty confident though that we'll receive something and that we should budget that $100,000. I think that's a good number. I think if we're off the mark on that, because it's budgetary neutral at this point in terms of I have 100 in revenue and 100,000 expenditures, there's not a lot of risk there that we're inflating our shortfall or reducing expenditures inappropriately. The ESSER 2 money, I believe, we've met preliminarily, worked through some of our spending plans or proposed spending plans. And so that is something that I do anticipate, hoping to have a more finalized plan that can be incorporated into the budget as we get to June. Now, I don't want you to hear me say we're going to be able to use $330,000 and supplement the budget and, we just reduced our shortfall by $330,000. I don't believe that's realistic. I also don't believe that's appropriate because we know those are one-time funds. So we want to plan accordingly for one-time uses or plan for how we're going to utilize those dollars now, but then in year 3, when that $330,000 goes away, what are we doing? Are we cutting something? Are we, we've purchased something, so now we don't have that expenditure moving forward? Those are the discussions that we're having now so that we don't position ourselves to get to year 3 and now have this huge shortfall from the federal funds that we don't know how to account for. So I do, I was long-winded, but the short answer is yes. I hope to have some better information to incorporate as we get to May and June.
Not necessarily state, however, not necessarily state budget.
Not the state, no. I mean, on the state revenue side, as we move closer to June, we're going to finalize our staffing. So we'll have a better number to refine Social Security reimbursement and PSERS reimbursement. Art and I are working through some of the transportation subsidy reporting right now. So if there's anything there that we need to refine, but in terms of basic education funding and special education funding, I don't anticipate any changes between now and the end of the year. We're probably looking at, just flatlining that compared to current budget.
Okay, thank you.
So then the next slide is really just a summary of the 3 revenue categories. So you can see, what that budget increase looks like from January to March. We're looking at an overall increase to revenue is about $955,000. Again, the increase to the local revenues is going to directly offset our budget shortfall. The increase in the federal revenues is budgetary neutral because we're increasing the expenditure side to account for those federal revenues. Okay. So then, obviously the next question is, okay, so what does that do? Kind of what does that look like, the bottom line? Now, what is our revised shortfall? What are we looking to do now moving forward to address that? And so estimated revenues, which we just talked about, a little less than $45.7 million. That does not include any type of tax increase. So again, if we would raise taxes to the maximum allowable index, that would add about $855,000 of new tax revenue to that total revenue number. Total estimated expenditures increasing to $48.9 million. And again, that increase, there's been no other changes at this point to expenditures other than assuming the increase in the federal dollars for those grants. So the revised estimated shortfall now before a millage increase would be 3.2. So, when we looked back initially at that first slide, I talked about the estimated increase as of January. We were looking about a $3.7 million shortfall prior to any tax increase. You can see now the impact of increasing and restoring those revenues has now brought that down to 3.2. So still a really large number, but that's something that, as we move through the budget season, it's always a good thing to reduce the shortfall and not increase the shortfall. And so our plan continues to be and has been, how do we now account for that? How do we take that $3.2 million shortfall and balance the budget when we get to June final budget adoption? And so like we've done in previous years, here's how we're going to do it. We're going to utilize some use of fund balance, right? We know there's an appropriate amount of one-time, non-recurring, variable expenses in our budget that appropriate use of fund balance to help offset, our budgetary shortfall is appropriate. Attritional savings on staffing. And so right now we're working through finalizing our staffing plans and looking at what the complement of staff looks like next year, taking into account retirements and replacements and, all of that flowing. And, when we get to that bottom line, our hope is always that we have some attritional savings that we can reduce the budget through some of that natural movement within our staff. Any type of millage rate increase, whether it be a full millage increase or a partial millage increase, as well as the combination of that revenue restoration, that will help us get to that number. And then targeted reductions. So, we get to a point where there's still a shortfall that needs to be addressed. And that's when we, get out our list of priorities and get out our list of potential cuts. And we work through that with our administrative team. We bring the board recommendations. And so, those are the categories that we'll continue to work on. So, I do anticipate bringing an update to the board again before we get to that, proposed final and final budget adoption to show what we've done and the work we've done on the expenditure side from January to March. And I think that's where, and that'll be met next month in April's presentation, but that's where we can talk a little bit about, okay, here's kind of how all those things are shaking out. We know, we're solid pretty much as of right now on the revenue side. Here are some of the proposed changes to expenditures. One of those proposed changes may be reduction of the capital reserve transfer. And so instead of, $550,000, maybe we're going to propose reducing that to $400,000. Or maybe we're going to come back with a plan to say, we finalize some of the grant funding and we believe we can use, X dollars, $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 for things that are already in our budget, that are one-time expenditures that we think are appropriate to use federal funding for, that meet the eligible uses. And so April is when we'll get into some more discussion on those expenditures and the implication of that. So, once, we talk about, it's easy to say to grab those big ticket items, the capital reserve transfer or the bus replacements, those big dollars that are easy to say, yep, there's $100,000 there, let's pull that out. But the other side of the discussion is, if we pull that out, this is what it means to try to restore that. And so while it's easy to say we're going to cut $100,000, it's not easy to say we need to add $100,000. So really being cognizant of what the implications are for those different streams. And, are they budget eliminations that are sustainable? That's something different than, is this a budget elimination that we can do for a couple of years, but then it creates a problem in the capital reserve with the capital projects. And what does that mean moving forward? And so we'll continue to work through that. And like I said, in April, bring an update to the board on, where we are year to date with some of those expenditures.
And I'll certainly open it up for questions before Leslie goes into the COVID expenses, but although there was some restoration of revenue, 3.2 is a big number, and it's a bigger number than we've dealt with historically speaking in my recollection. And so it's a really large number to be able to bring down a reduction from a composite of all of the things that Leslie has on that slide to bring you ultimately a balanced budget is sort of, it's not sort of, it is our goal, and we will do that, but it will not be without some of those tough decisions coming forward.
Yeah, and again, I think the important thing is while it appears we're finding new revenue, it's not really new revenue. It's a restoration of revenue that had to be reduced, that didn't have to be, that we chose to reduce because of the uncertainty of COVID and what was happening. So, it's restoration of the tax base, not new tax revenues. And so, although it is a positive thing and it's good news, It's not great news in that it's new revenue. It's just existing revenue that we can now account for again. Okay, next slide. So I just wanted to briefly show, I have 2 slides here for you on kind of where we stand as of right now and what we anticipate the next 1 and 2 years in terms of COVID-related grants or reimbursement funds. And so we have tried our hardest this year to track and code and account for COVID-related expenditures, to then try to find any funding stream or reimbursement that we can to help offset those costs. As you go back and think about and look at the 2021 budget, we earmarked about $50,000 for COVID-related expenditures. Looking at that now, we talked about, was that too high? Was that too much? You laugh in hindsight's 2020, but not even close to what we needed or will expend this year for COVID-related things. So this slide outlines just kind of the money that we've received to date. Of course, like anything coming from the state or the federal government, everything has a different reporting deadline. Everything has a different grant end date. And so we have worked really hard to try to make sure we stay on top of that, that we're accounting for expenditures in one grant and not another. And so I think we, as a team collectively, we've kept things, we have things in a really good place to really try to maximize the dollars where we can. And so you can see here, PCCD COVID first round of funding. We received that, I'm going to say really late in the summer, early fall, and that had an end date of October 30th of 2020. So we received a little less than $204,000 that we basically had about 2 months to spend. Now, some of those costs could go back to the March timeframe, but obviously, we were just getting into the school year, just starting to see what our needs were, and so we were able to fully utilize those funds, but it took a lot of planning in a short time frame to accomplish that. We did submit reimbursement through FEMA. I submitted 2 applications of funding. So what I did was, once we went through some of those other federal grants and state grants and allocated some of our COVID expenditures, went through the remaining expenditures and said, okay, what can we do to maximize this reimbursement? We were very successful, I'll say, in receiving, about $45,000 of FEMA reimbursement. So, that was a positive thing. That was $45,000 that, we didn't have to expend or find elsewhere in our general fund budget. PCCD then released a second round of COVID money. That money has to be expended by June 30th of 21. That's about $65,000. We received a special ed COVID mitigation grant that runs through 9/30. However, we are anticipated to expend those dollars, that $5,000, by June 30th of this year. Then we received the first round of ESSERS and CARES funding, that $140,000. Although that can be funded through 2022, we do anticipate utilizing that full funding probably through the end of this June. And then, as we talked about before, as part of the budget discussions for next year, the ESSER 2 round 2 funding, that has a grant end date of 9/30 of 23. And so our plan as of right now would be to utilize half of those funds in 21-22, and then half of those funds in 22-23, not use any funds moving forward into the 23-24 school year. And so some of the things that, this is the grant funding that we've received to date. So the next slide, we're going to talk about the expenditures to date, but also recognizing that we have recurring and additional expenditures that will happen between now and June, which will, some of these grants the plan is to utilize for those. So we're using the grant funds for anything from, COVID-related supplies, cleaning supplies, PPE, masks, shields, plexiglass. We talked earlier about the nurses' renovations, some of the digital online learning. So we're really, anything that has an eligible use, we've tried to identify and put into that grant. I'm really cognizant of the fact that most of these funds are federal funds. And so they come with a whole other set of rules for procurement and purchasing. And so really strategizing and making sure that what we're using these funds for both meets the eligible uses, but also the procurement guidelines. And that has been challenging at times because they're so low and because they differ from Pennsylvania. So now not only do we have to worry about complying with Pennsylvania procurement rules, we have another set of rules that are the federal funding. So I think we're doing our best to maximize that, make sure we're still in compliance, but not utilize these funds to their full extent. And so looking at, total expenditures to date, when we go back to March of 2020 through January of 21, we have spent about $851,000 on total COVID-related expenditures. Yep, stay on that graph, please. Thanks. And so of that amount, we all know $332,000 were for the HVAC bipolar ionization units. And that was funded out of the capital projects fund that we talked about in the presentation earlier. So when you look at, backing that amount out, we've spent about $519,000 of general fund expenditures through January of 21 out of the general fund. If you go back to the slide, the previous slide for the grant related funds, for 2021, we're receiving about $460,000. So we have additional costs above and beyond what were received in the grant funding. However, I think, it's not as significant as it could be if we didn't receive any of that funding. And so, the note at the bottom, projected spending through June 30th is not included in this slide. This is just year to date. And so we do anticipate additional spending in the categories of online learning. So we're paying monthly fees for some of the students attending some of those digital programs that we've contracted with. Any additional PPE or cleaning supplies. We've done our best to utilize some of those federal funds and bought stuff as we need it, but recognizing that those, COVID expenditures that aren't going away, that we'll still have into next year, trying to maximize and say, what are we going to buy this year with leftover budget funds? What additional federal dollars may be coming that we can allocate for the use of some of that. But those are probably the three areas. In addition, we've talked about charter schools and we talked about cyber school enrollment. And so that's not included in here. Obviously, we don't know that there's a direct correlation to COVID and charter enrollment. However, we have seen increases in our charter students that, if you ask our opinion, is probably related to COVID and COVID reasons and the method of delivery of instruction models. And so as a caveat here, in addition, we have an increase of 17 cyber student enrollments compared to last year. And so that's a significant number, and that's a significant amount, which we've talked about. That is really an added cost to this $851,000. Any questions on the COVID, the grants, the expenditures before I move into the budget projections?
Leslie, I think to clear this up a little bit, maybe, because there's a lot of moving parts and pieces and pluses and minuses and federal grants and whatever. And the timing that Bill brought up as well related to just how the heck we budget revenue that we just don't even know if it's going to come in. Would it be feasible or possible for you to create a COVID expense and a COVID revenue line in our budget so that we can really see what the business as usual budget looks like separate from this, I'll call it kind of the shadow COVID budget, so that we're not making long-term decisions based on short-term COVID-related expenses or movements or revenue. We don't know whether or not it'll come. You see what I'm asking? Like almost a
I do. Yeah, I do. And I agree with you in that would be the ideal situation. Unfortunately, I can't necessarily break all of that stuff out. So I have to code expenditures and revenues with whatever account codes the state has prescribed and is indicating that need to be charged to. And so even internally right now, we struggle with, I'll give Art's budget as an example. So Art has a supply budget contained in the Buildings and Grounds Department budget. But he's purchasing all of these items, and some of them I'm taking out of his budget and putting them into a grant. And some of them are staying in his budget because we don't have offsetting grant funding. There's not a good mechanism to kind of carve out and identify this is COVID related in terms of the financial reports. Now, what I can do is I can, in an Excel spreadsheet as we do monthly reports and stuff, kind of pull some of that out. And some of our budget summaries that I put together, we can kind of have those asterisks of like, these are COVID related revenues and expenditures, but it is going to be very difficult for trending moving forward, but also historically. One of the things we've talked about, transportation, for example, looking at that budget, I had this conversation with Jen this morning. It's going to be really hard to analyze transportation costs because in 1920, we stopped driving from March to June. Our miles are down, but our diesel costs remain the same because we were committed to buying those gallons. However, those diesel gallons were purchased through heating oil, which is in a different budget. Looking at driver wages and driver hours, we know we paid them because we were mandated by the state in 1920. But then as we move into 2021, we're not driving, or the bulk of our drivers aren't driving on a Wednesday because of online learning. And so it will be very difficult in the upcoming years. So, as always, I will try to identify that. And for my own internal purposes, we have spreadsheets that are tracking this and maintaining this, and copies of invoices. So we have a big stack so that when grant funding comes, I flip through and say, what can I pull out of this stack? But I will try to do that. We are confined though as to like where the state is telling us things need to be coded. It's not a great answer, but it's really all I can offer at this point.
Still, back of the envelope, pro forma format's fine with me.
Yeah. So moving forward in some of the summary slides and some of the, when we get to the proposed final budget and we talk about prior year spending and current year budget and proposed spending, I will try to pull out some of the COVID related things so that, again, like you said, we can see kind of our normal operating expenditures and our trends compared to what these hopefully one-time costs associated with COVID are.
It's one of the reasons Leslie tracks what it is that we're doing, but it'll be like that asterisk when we tried the transfer for the stadium. This was the transfer for the stadium year. The difference is these are across multiple different categories. But yes, if we have it tracked, we can just do it separately.
Yeah, and this happens frequently to us. Maybe not, definitely at the granular level that I'm working with. PDE changes account codes all the time, and so there used to be an account code for electricity in the 400 objects and the 600 objects. And so year to year, we looked at the 400s and the 600s and we trended it that way. Then PDE eliminated the 400 category. Now everything's down in the 600. Same thing has happened over the years with property and supplies and technology. Sometimes one year it was in the 700 categories. The next year it's all up in the 600 categories. And so it does make looking at historical reporting and trends very difficult. And so that's where, we rely heavily on the spreadsheets and the documents that we create internally in my office to make sure that when we get to that next year, we go, oh yeah, that's right. That's what was in there. Or that was a year that we bought 5 buses and that's why transportation costs in that year were significantly higher. And so, there's oftentimes not a great mechanism other than, the documentation that we're doing internally through the budget process to make sure that we're capturing everything appropriately.
I think, Leslie, just this pie chart you have here with the 851,000 compared to the slide before it showing us we got 460,000 in grant is I think a good start to show us how much more we're paying this year for COVID than we did in previous years.
Yep. Yeah, and as I'm thinking through this and as we're discussing, maybe what I'll look to do for next month is put together, maybe in the financial reports, we could put together some kind of COVID report. And so we can start tracking kind of on a month-to-month basis the COVID impact. I think that's something that certainly we're doing internally, but may be helpful at the board level if that's something you'd like to see.
Okay.
Okay. The next couple slides are budget projections. So there's a lot of information on here. We are utilizing the Forecast 5 budgeting software right now. Lots of great information, lots of trending, lots of historical data for us to use. So this is really a summary screen out of that software that I pulled to show, and it's pretty small on the slide here, but if you open the presentation and kind of see it on your screen, show the impact of the trends. And so looking on a 5-year basis, assuming the maximum allowable tax increase every year for the next 5 years, what does that do to the assumptions of our budget or budget shortfall looking ahead? And so as you can see, and certainly the graph pictorial of what that does to our year-end fund balances, if we would commit to increasing taxes to the maximum allowable increase, we would have some sustainable revenue growth, which would help offset expenditure increases and really maintain about a $2 to $2.5 million shortfall in each of the next 5 years. Again, this is status quo. So this is basing this off of assumptions built from the 2021 budget, assuming status quo of staffing. So we know there'll be changes, but really kind of a worst case scenario, if we don't make any budgetary changes this year or next year, kind of what are we looking at, assuming we would raise taxes in each of those years. The other positive thing, if you would go back to these charts and look at our 5-year projections from the fall, one of the biggest differences in these shortfalls is the change of the Act 1 assumptions. And I have a chart on a slide, 2 slides down that we'll talk about. We've made some significant changes in our Act 1 assumptions, which have had a significant impact on these 5-year budget projections, assuming the tax increase. Because obviously the Act 1 index is the number that generates and determines the new taxes year to year. So if you go to the next page, please. This is the same information, however, assuming that we would not raise taxes in any year the next 5 years. And so you can see what that does, both in the graph there on the bottom of the blue lines to the fund balance projections, but also looking at those shortfalls. So on the previous slide, we looked at what those shortfalls would look like, and they almost look a little bit more sustainable and more manageable, hovering right around 2.5 million. If we don't raise taxes the next 5 years, that number, that shortfall grows by year 5 to $7.8 million. And so, why the significant difference? It's really being driven by the tax increase. And so the compounding effect of building that tax increase into your base year after year is what really makes the difference. Expenditure assumptions and all other revenue assumptions are identical between this chart and the one prior. The only thing changing is the impact of a tax increase. And so, it may be somewhere in the middle. We may choose to raise taxes one year, not raise taxes another year. But this is really just to show the impact and the drastic difference in different decision-making points as it relates to taxes. So if you go to the next slide, it just really puts together in a quick little chart the comparison of those budget projections. And so you can see going across from left to right, the blue line, in 2021, if there's no tax increase, we're looking at about a $3 million shortfall. As you move to 2025, that increases to 7.8. However, if you factor in the tax increase, in 2021, we're looking at about that $2.2 million shortfall, and that sustains, raises a little bit, goes anywhere from 2 to 2.5 over the next 5 years. Now, again, in comparison to what we were looking at earlier in the year, there's a couple assumption changes that I factor in, and they're down in the box below. So the first are the Act 1 assumptions. We had done really conservative, assumed the Act 1 would, other than this year, be significantly lower in upcoming years. The IFO, the Independent Fiscal Office, published a report with some data that says otherwise. And I believe that report was sent to you in a Friday board report. However, the gist of that report as to why those assumptions are higher than they are is really just a function of the dollars of the mechanic of the formula. And so although COVID has increased unemployment, the trends that the state of Pennsylvania and the IFO have found are that the higher wage earners across the state are still working. And so the unemployment is coming from the lower wage earners. And so when you look at the statewide average weekly wage, which is part of that calculation for the Act 1 index, it's actually increasing because the lower wage earners are unemployed and not factored into that calculation. And so the calculation is complicated. There's different pieces, but that's really, my takeaway from the sessions that I've been on and the reading through that report is that's really driving these increases in the Act 1 assumptions. And so they look significantly higher than what we had planned on. We were looking at the 2s, the 3s, and as you can see, they're projecting a 4.2, a 3.8. And so that significantly increases our ability to raise taxes if in fact those Act 1 indexes hold true. The second thing has been real estate collection. So if you recall back to prior budget presentations or projections rather, we had reduced the collection percentage down to 95. I was very conservative in the fall of when we would restore that back to 96. So I had looked at 21, 22 of being a 95% again, then increasing it to 95.5. We saw that strong collection of taxes through December, which I believe is enough to increase that back to 96. So the impact of increasing and again, restoration of those revenues, like we talked about earlier, to that 96% helps the bottom line, helps the compounding effect of that base moving forward in our projection. And then the same with assessed value growth. As of right now, I'm not seeing a ton of real estate assessed value growth. However, we know homes are selling. We know there's properties being built. We do anticipate some new commercial property in the district, albeit it's not huge dollars and huge, tons of warehouses and commercial properties, but it will be something. And so I've restored some of that assessed value growth. In 21, 22, I still have it at 0.5%, but then increase that back up to 1% growth. And so that would be natural growth in our assessed value year to year, which obviously generates some additional revenue for us. And so these assumption changes are really what's driving the revenue assumptions and those 5-year projections with a tax increase to levelize around that $2.5 million. However, it could go the opposite way. We could make the changes to assumption that we'd have no assessed value growth, that the Act 1 index goes back to the 2.5s and the 3s. And then that significantly will impact, and we'll go back to seeing the 2.5, 3.5, up to $4 million shortfalls. Really contingent on those revenue assumptions. And then my final slide of this evening is really next step. So where do we go from here? So April workshop, we're going to update the assumptions, present changes on our expenditures from January. So really kind of come full circle with the budget. So you have a good idea of what's been changed and what updated assumptions we have from January. And so then as we move from April into May, we'll have a firm number and a better understanding of what that proposed final budget looks like for May. During the months of April and into May, we finalize our staffing plans. We're going to make our necessary adjustments in the budget. The April presentation won't have significant changes to staffing because until we kind of finalize our plan and lay that all out, a lot of times we'll see that change the budgetary numbers as we move closer into May budget adoption. The May workshop, we're going to present the proposed final budget, which is a mandated document by PDE. We have to submit, we have to follow those timelines. May board does require formal approval to adopt that proposed final budget. We'll make some additional tweaks, last minute changes, present that at the June workshop, and then again, final budget adoption at our June board meeting to be in compliance with PDE requirements of adopting a budget by June 30th. Any questions?
Leslie, the expenditure side of the budget, when do you feel that you're going to be pretty firm on those numbers?
Yep, so I'll have an update for you in April. Update primarily non-salary and benefit related areas. If we have some known firmed up staffing changes in the healthcare renewal, some of those things, I will make those updates if we have those firmed up. However, any significant changes that we're going to make or any, kind of rollout of our formal staffing plan for next year, most likely will all be held till May so that we have time to finalize those plans and work that into the budget and make sure that, we have a good number there. But I will provide updates on all the other expenditure items next month in April.
Oh, thank you. So that last bar chart you had there is pretty grim to me anyway. It looks like if we raise our taxes every year to the Act 1, we're still going to be just under $2.5 million short of revenues to our expenses. And I know, I just...
It buys us 3 years.
We're going to do something.
Hitting zero.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of work to do. And so, I started this off that this was positive information. And while it is positive information, we still have a $3 million shortfall. And so we do have a lot of work to do. And so, we'll update and make some assumptions and make some changes for April. However, there's lots of decision points that are still to be made as we move through the budget process. That could have an impact as we move into May on the budget, whether it be a decision on reconfiguration, whether it be a decision on, cuts that we're looking to make in those different areas. And so, while I'm going to bring some updates to expenditures in April, we still will have additional expenditure cuts to narrow down and get closer to balancing that budget as we move from April to May.
Yeah, now look at that 2.4 million, that's really our EIT revenues that we have every year. And it's also what we're spending in charter schools. So, that gap, we know what's causing it, but we're gonna have to take it out of someplace else. That's gonna affect all the kids in the district.
Yeah, when you go back to that slide about budget uncertainty, charter enrollment is a huge question mark right now. And so we have enrollment numbers factored into the budget. We have some contingency funding built in, not knowing how many potential students we may leave if we don't offer an online option next year. And so until we work through and finalize those plans, that's one particular account code or object code in the budget that we could see some significant change between, where that stands today and what it looks like in June. And so, the hope is certainly that we can reduce it, but, realistically, we may get to June and say we need to account for 20 additional charter school enrollments. And when you look at, 20 additional kids leaving for charter schools at approximately $15,000 a kid, that's an additional $300,000 to the budget. And so that's where we need to figure out how to make that work. We need to creatively use the federal grant dollars. And we'll do that. We'll build our plan and we'll maximize the dollars, and, we'll get to June and we will make it work. Not without pain, because some decisions are not, warm and fuzzy and feel great. But we also need to look for the future, and we need to look at these 5-year budget projections and realize we need some sustainable changes to the budget to make it all work moving forward.
Just one clarifying question. Is the capital project that was presented or outlined earlier for the middle school, was that read into your numbers here?
So that wouldn't be in here, no, because your 5-year projections are based off of your general fund budget. So that does not account for any capital dollars, whether it be capital reserve or capital projects. The only assumption built into those 5-year budget projections are the planned general fund transfer from general fund into capital reserve on an annual basis. So when you looked at the individual funding fiscal year to fiscal year, that planned transfer will mirror what's in the budget projections. But yeah, in terms of taking on new debt, in terms of additional projects that we may be funded or potential reduction of the capital reserve transfer, that is not factored in. That's something that future discussions. I did not want to assume that we would borrow money, that we would do an $11 million project. And so I didn't build any kind of new debt assumptions into the 5-year budget projections, because certainly, that would obviously make it look worse. And so until we would get closer to, refining a project, if we're going to do a project, if it's going to be 22-23 or 23-24, when we get to that planning stage, that's when I would update the 5-year projections. The other thing to keep in mind is, we wrap our debt. We do have some debt issuances that will be coming off in a few years. We have a couple refunding opportunities that we still have in the upcoming year. So, none of that is factored in until we have a little bit more information as we get closer to those target dates.
Okay, any other questions for Leslie before we move on with the rest of the finance agenda? Okay, I don't see any, Leslie, so can we continue with our point?
So the next agenda item is delinquent taxes, and this was just a summary that I put together. I think Todd had a question regarding kind of what does our historical collection look like? What are we looking in terms of delinquent taxes? So I have 2 different data points here that I pulled and put together to show the board some information on our delinquent taxes. So as you know, Portnoy Law Associates is our delinquent tax collector, has been with the district as long as I've been here. We work very collaboratively with them on the collection of our delinquent taxes. So basically, our tax collectors, our 4 elected tax collectors, collect our taxes from July 1st through December 31st. We do a final settlement of the taxes, and then anything left unpaid as of December 31st, we turn over to Portnoy, and then Portnoy becomes the delinquent collector and then tracks and collects money from the taxpayers. for those outstanding tax bills that are due, as well as then coordinates any kind of tax liens, bankruptcy filings, handles all of that on behalf of the district. And then we receive remittance of tax collections from them periodically. So the first sheet here, you'll see just highlights the top column there is how many bills and the dollar value where it says base tax, that would be the dollar value at flat. So assuming 100%, not at discount at a 2% discount, not a penalty of a 10% penalty, but at that base, if the taxpayer would have paid during that flat base period, what the value of that tax bill would be. So you can see going from 15-16 to what we currently turned over in 2021. Back in 15-16, we turned over about 260 bills for a total of about $704,000. Compared to what we just turned over this past January, we turned over 188 bills valued at about $570,000. So you can see over time we varied, anywhere from, this year was an all-time low compared to, looking at 17-18, we turned over about 850,000 and about 100 more tax bills than what we turned over this year. And so, there is some flux year to year in what we've seen and what we've turned over. The middle line there is outstanding as of 12/31/20. So looking at what is still owed to us from each of those fiscal years as of the end of this past December. So you can see from the 15-16 bills that we turned over, there's still 30 outstanding for a total of $26,000. And then obviously looking at the 2021, they haven't started, well, they started now, but as of the date of this analysis, they hadn't started collecting. So you can see the full 188 bills at the 570. Then I have showed you there below the percentage outstanding. And so obviously the number of bills doesn't necessarily correlate to the total dollar value because, one bill may be significant or there may be a lot of bills that are, $25, $30 because it's just the outstanding balance that's carried year to year. So you can see the percentage collections there that are outstanding as of December 31st. And then coupled with that, the last line, then I have the delinquent tax collections by fiscal year. So 2021, we've got $900,000 budgeted for delinquent tax collections. Obviously, we're not through the year. We don't have that number yet. But looking back, we had a high in 17-18 of a little over $1 million. And then last year, we saw our collections really take a dip because Portnoy did not collect when the pandemic hit. And we looked at we realized about $783,000 in 19-20. So if you open up the next chart, then I just threw this into a graph to kind of give you a visual to say, I think one of Todd's questions was, how old, what is still outstanding? And so you can see of our total balance outstanding as of December 31st, we have tax bills going back to the 2004-2005 school year. You'll see in the far left-hand column there. And then obviously the highest amount of bills outstanding relate to the 19-20 school year. So this chart shows both the number of bills as well as the total value of those bills in each of those fiscal years.
I don't know if that addresses what you were looking for.
It does. I mean, essentially what you're saying is we got 487,000 that was never collected, probably won't get collected. Some of that might, right? I guess some of that 2018-19 probably have a chance of collecting some of that. I guess my question would be is what, at some point there's $500,000 sitting out there that's essentially owed to the district. Mm-hmm. Do we ever provide a one-time, deal to these folks to say, pay it off at 50% of face value, or do we just maintain these deeds, put these houses on the market, et cetera?
Yeah, I think, that's certainly an interesting concept. I believe that's probably something that the board has the right to do and can make that decision. Portnoy, I'll tell you, like the outstanding bills from 2004-05, Portnoy is still actively trying to recoup those dollars. And so, that may be an instance where the taxpayer has paid off of everything, then the property sold and there's like penalty and interest still outstanding. They actively go after and try to work with taxpayers in terms of payment plans. And so we see some smaller dollar amounts trickling in. However, they're consistently paying and they're still paying over time. Portnoy has done a nice job at working with the taxpayer. And so, I think school districts get a bad rap of we put people out of their homes and we send them to sheriff's sale and, it's the district. We don't send a lot of properties to sheriff's sale. We certainly join in and kind of get in line as a creditor when properties get sent to sheriff's sale, but oftentimes it's the mortgage company or a creditor that's sending them, not us. Very few. It takes a lot, and I'm not saying not any, because we have had some. Although most of the properties in my time at the district that we have sent to sheriff's sale have never actually gone. The taxpayers made an effort, pays off the balance or pays a portion of the balance, and kind of it comes off the list. Bankruptcy is another category that, we work with Portnoy. If one of our taxpayers who's delinquent declares bankruptcy, Portnoy runs a report and sends us an analysis to say, kind of, here's what we're looking at. It's worth getting in and, paying the filing fee and filing the documents to, recoup anything at the end of the day, or it's really not, and we're going to write this off and, deem it uncollectible. So while certainly you have the ability to do that, I don't believe it eliminates your exposure year to year, because I believe annually you're going to have taxpayers that either can't or choose not to pay their tax bill. And so, you may eliminate that, and at a 50% discount, everybody pays it off, but it's going to be perpetual because every year we turn over to delinquent collections.
Thank you. It was good.
Any other questions about delinquent taxes before we move on? That was just information. Yeah, we've never, that I remember, ever forced a sheriff's sale. We always kind of piggybacked on some other legal activity to try to recoup what's owed, but and I don't know if it's the same people every year, same guy, I don't know. But it's Portnoy runs an analysis, and there's taxpayers that I get the form that says they're recommending we send to sheriff's sale, and like they owe 7 years worth of taxes. So in my opinion, Portnoy is not aggressive at kind of giving up on the taxpayer and saying we're taking you to sheriff's sale. I think they do everything they can to work with that taxpayer to put them on a payment plan, to help them figure out how to finance and pay off those taxes. So that, like I said, there are very few properties that we as the district send. There's always properties that are in sheriff's sale though. Okay, Leslie, good job with that. Let's move on to the next item, auditor proposal. We discussed this a little bit.
We did. This is a 3-year proposal that we received from Gorman and Associates. There is an increase of the audit fee of about $1,000. However, it's an increase for the current 2021 audit, should you choose to go with Gorman. And then it's held at $21,000 after that. The single audit fee, and I'm sorry, I'm on page 7 of the proposal if you want to reference and look at the pricing. The single audit fee, if required, because we do exceed the dollar threshold for a federal audit with federal dollars, we do have to pay for that single audit fee and have that single audit. So it's additional $3,000. That has remained the same throughout our current proposal. The AFR fee, if desired, that is the annual report that we have to submit to PDE at the end of October. We do not utilize Gorman service for that. We handle that report in-house and file that ourselves. So we don't incur that cost. And then the hourly rate of additional services of $90. You'll see there's a slight increase of $92 in the 22-23 school year. We utilize these hourly rates. So in a year that we have a bond refinancing or borrow new money, there's additional work that is required as part of the audit. And so that is outside the scope of the normal audit fee, and we would get charged the hourly rate in that circumstance. But again, that only happens in certain years where, where we're doing something additional outside of our normal operating. Or, if there's a new GASB pronouncement and there's new additional schedules. A couple of years ago, if you remember, we had to change some reporting and create some new schedules related to our TIF. And so we were charged some additional funds there. We certainly do the legwork if we can, provide the schedules, provide the footnotes, but certainly there's obviously audit work that needs to be accompanied with that. So my proposal would be to, I would recommend executing and approving the contract for the 3-year extension with Gorman and Associates. However, if it is the board's desire to, solicit proposals from other firms, we certainly can do that as well.
Well, I think we discussed this last time and we all agreed that we should go ahead with Gorman. And if there are any questions or comments, we'll take them now. Otherwise, we'll take action on this item in 2 weeks. Hearing on, let's move on to the next one, Leslie.
Okay, thank you. The next item is just a routine item. Annually, you board approve the Carbon Lehigh Intermediate Unit Student Driver Education Program. You'll see in the agenda item there, we had 42 students who participated in 1920 and 33 who have participated so far in the 2021 school year. So, we definitely believe that there's value to this program and would recommend approval of that agreement for the upcoming year.
Okay. Okay, we'll take action on this in 2 weeks.
Okay.
On the reports.
Yep, so there's not really much to report in terms of monthly activity. January is a relatively slow month in terms of collections. You will see we received about $17,000 in real estate transfer taxes, received special ed subsidy of about 209, all routine scheduled subsidies. Collections of our EIT, this is actually the first month where we are kind of going in the red. And so compared to 2020 collections from January of last year, our collections of EIT are down about $36,000 or about 2.63%. So if you recall, going back to the budget for 2021, we had assumed about a 10% decrease in that funding. We are not seeing that at this point. Right now, we're at about that 2.6. So we'll continue to watch that and trend through the rest of the year. However, early projections from Berkheimer are looking like we should finish the year pretty consistent in collections to where we've seen in the past. And then on expenditures, the only thing I've mentioned here is, January is the time that we do all of our reversals of our audit entries from the financial statement audit. So if you're looking at the detailed reports, you'll see some, debits where there's typically credits or things. Those are just entries to reverse and kind of reset our books for the 2021 school year. And we do that at completion of the audit once everything is finalized and our audit report is done. So we try to do that consistently in January from an analysis standpoint, month to month. If you can see, there are month-to-date payroll costs, benefit costs, not a lot of significant funding. January is a month that we have principal payments due on our debt issuances. That's all I have for reports.
Any questions on reports before we move on? And we will receive them in 2 weeks. And the last item under finances is an update on the trash bid.
Yeah, so we did finally receive, we communicated with Waste Management. We had reached out to them and asked their intention to continue the contract and what, if they would be willing to hold the pricing. They did come back and say they're not willing to hold the pricing. They are proposing a 3% increase to our current contract pricing. Because of the increase, we talked about, and because of some of the service problems we're having, we believe it's appropriate to do a trash bid. We have not done one since the 2013-14 school year. Given the proposed increase and given the current state of what's going on, we just feel like we need to do our due diligence. It's been quite some time. And so, what are we talking about in terms of numbers? Our trash costs really have not grown very significantly over the last, 10, 15 years. So the current bid right now is, and so the way that our trash bid works, we pay a monthly fee for pickup for September through June. And then summer pickup, we pay a fee per call. So obviously we're not in session in the summer. We don't have nearly as much trash. And so we call when those dumpsters get, full to the point where we need pickup. So the bid is for basically the 10 months while we're in session. Current school year bid is about $19,137. That has, held pretty steady over time. And so, we're hopeful that we can receive a bid. We understand that, proposed increase from Waste Management, it has been a long time that they've held that rate. But equally, they need to understand our requirements and our purchasing requirements and doing our due diligence. So the recommendation at this time would be to put together and put a trash bid out.
Okay, does board have an appetite to go out for trash bids? See 'em. Say again?
Said take out the trash.
They proposed an increase last year too.
1% increase is what they had proposed last year.
Said no.
So we've been with them for, since 13, 14?
No, we have been with them. My system dates back to 2004-5. We've been with them at least since 2004, 2005, probably even longer if I had to guess, but I don't have access to those records at my fingertips. We've done bids in the past, and Waste Management has been the winning bidder. If you recall, back in 13-14, we rebid. They were the winning bidder, but increased the price on us. So certainly that's the risk that we run. However, we're really, it's more appropriate because they are not extending the contract and not holding the price to really rebid this. It's not really deemed a professional service. It is something that is biddable. So, I think extending the contract worked for us because it was a true extension and we weren't seeing increases. And now we're just not at that position anymore. I wouldn't be surprised if Waste Management is the winning bidder again. Last time around, we didn't have many bidders. We didn't have many vendors. So, I think it's just, we'll wait and see. I know locally, Waste Management used to service Upper Macungie, and there's a new trash vendor that was awarded that contract this past year. So maybe there are some more vendors in the market that, we'll have some luck with. The thing to keep in mind here, just kind of as an FYI, is we also have recycling services that we pay for. So Waste Management provides free recycling at Weisenberg. However, we pay for Kugels up on the main campus for some of the recycling that Waste Management doesn't have included. And so this bid would represent the trash collection. If Waste Management would not be the successful bidder, we would have to address recycling specifically at Weisenberg, as well as the piece of recycling up on main campus that Waste Management would currently be servicing for us. But all things that Art and I are working on, trying to make sure those bid specs capture our trash.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's put it out for bid, see what happens, and we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for running through all this, and another great presentation, trying to make it difficult look simple for us, but we've got a way to go there, and appreciate all the work that you put into it this far. Okay, the next item on the agenda is under old business, and this is just information about the two people who did apply for the trustee at large position at LTRI-C. One of them is our own Rachel Scheffler, who was interested in it, and we have a nomination application from her on your device. And then the second one is DJ Walbert, who, as you know, is the president of our foundation, who expressed an interest as well. So the board, each sponsoring district to LTRI-C has the opportunity to submit one name as a nominee, as a candidate for the trustee at large. So in 2 weeks, we will have to make a decision, and we'll send that nomination, however we vote on in 2 weeks from now, we'll send that down to LTRI-C.
Just to note that because there's personal information, address, et cetera, they're under admin content. So if they're admin content, if you didn't sign in, you won't see them, but they are there.
And that ballot, that application that they filled out will be the ballot that will be circulated among all of the 15 sponsoring districts for LTRI-C and be voted on by every board. So 9 times 15 people will be electing this trustee. And we don't know which other school district are going to submit names. So it's we're in the run. And we had two great candidates. I think either one of them would be an excellent trustee down there. And best wishes to Rachel, you, and DJ if you're with us. Any other old business? Or Rachel, would you like to say anything?
Oh, no, thanks, Bill. I mean, it's just looking forward to hopefully the professional opportunity to serve in another board in a different capacity. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Any other old business from any board member before we move on?
Yeah, Bill.
Yes.
I wanted to see if maybe we should put on an update for where we are for returning back to school.
You want to field that, Mrs. Holman? I think you're getting ready for that.
Certainly. So Dr. Sosnovic and I have a plan for a presentation at your March 17th meeting that talks a little bit about our COVID data. We are, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, under elementary reconfiguration, quickly approaching moderate. So I do think that changes some things in terms of the recommendations from PDE and Department of Health about social distancing, certainly not mask requiring, but social distancing. And as you heard earlier, we have very articulately mapped out our classrooms and know how many students we can fit in there. And so I do think that we could give you an update at the March 17th meeting about that. But you did hear we will likely be rolling out plans for 4th and 5th grade. There was information, you probably heard the governor's announcement today about teachers being prioritized for vaccinations for the Johnson & Johnson vaccination, should they wish to get it, and how they will roll that out through intermediate units as well as school district personnel. We did send that out to our staff today. They are anticipated to get 94,000 vaccinations as early as March 12th for teachers or school staff, not just teachers, school staff. And they are prioritizing those that work with students in the pre-K through 5, as well as the most vulnerable populations, which they identify, obviously, as do we, students with disabilities, as well as English language learners. And so I don't know when the next set of doses after that initial 94,000 will come, but that certainly was welcome news, I believe, from our faculty as well. But certainly we have begun the process already of bringing our students back, social distancing in mind, have done so successfully, are one of the first to do so successfully. Other districts are beginning to announce plans and dates as we move forward into, the end of March, even fourth marking period, the beginning of April. So hopefully I'll be able to give you a little bit better update that Dr. Sosnovic and I already have planned for April 17th at the regular board meeting. Again, no action, just an update on where we are. What did I say? March 17th, sorry, March 17th. So certainly, Joe, if there's certainly specific questions you would like us to answer, you can get those to me, but I believe it will answer some of the questions you might have.
Thank you.
There are a lot of moving parts going on right now with a lot of activity with the state, with the health departments, and the COVID cases going down. The CDC is coming out with, I don't know if they're guidelines or requirements these days anymore, with distancing and other things. Shots for the teachers is new on the horizon. And if they ever tell us we have to put bipolar devices in our HVAC, we're ahead of the game there. So we'll wait for your report in 2 weeks from now when things settle down a little bit and we can see where we stand. Any other old business on the board? Let's move into new business. There's not on the agenda. Does any board member have a new business item? Hearing none, at this time in the meeting, we once again will go back to offering courtesy to the floor for anybody who would like to make public comment and address the board. And I would again like to thank everybody who is still with us for this meeting. You can see we have a lot of things going on at a board meeting. There are lots of activity and a lot of issues to consider. And at this time, we would entertain anybody who would like to address the board. Please do so by raising your hand on your device and then begin with your name and address, please.
Not see anybody.
Nobody raising their hand?
No, sir. Give them another second, but I do not see.
Okay, we're gonna give you another couple of minutes here to raise your hand if you'd like to address the board. We're not seeing any. Maybe there's a lot of information tonight. How many people we have here?
We
Still
are
have
dropping off, but there's 6 currently.
six of us. Well, yeah, there was a lot of information. I really appreciate you holding off on comments at the beginning of the meeting so you can see what's going on. And maybe perhaps we did answer some of the questions you had and cleared up some things. But thank you for being with us.
I did send all of you an email today. If there were comments that came in via email, there were several that had very specific student issues. They were put in that folder and shared with you. So there are a few in there that you should review as well.
Okay. Given that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion by Mr. Rex.
Second.
Third, fourth, fifth, and sixth.
Second. Todd, Dr. Ward, Rosemary listed. 4 seconds.
Your pie sandwich are on.
Okay, motion, meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Let us know when we're out.
If I'm still a little confused about.
Are we on?
Approval.
Mike?
Just hold on.